Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
One Piece Randomizer by Grey Ninja 27i. An ordinary boy dies and is reincarnated into the body of none other than Monkey D. Luffy, equipped with a randomizer system. What he doesn't realize is that this system doesn't just influence his life, it influences the entire world around him. The warlord of my channeler, What If Lord, Black Money Young Leon, Garrick Russell, Ben Brownlee, Case Clark, Tristan Ward, KSG, PL4YZ, Brian McKenzie. Join the channel membership if you will like to support the channel. Adios.
16th Branch Raid, Raphael System. 16th Branch Marine Base. The salty sea breeze drifted lazily through the open barracks windows, carrying the cries of distant seagulls and the rhythmic lapping of waves against the docks. Inside, a handful of lower-ranked Marines lounged about, passing the time with half-hearted tasks and idle conversation. Jiro, a tall, lanky Marine, sat atop a wooden crate, absent-mindedly running an oilcloth over the length of a musket. You ever wonder why we even bother cleaning these things? Ain't like we ever get to use them. Across from him, Kenta, a shorter, round-faced Marine, yawned, propping his feet up on another crate. Protocol, Jiro. Gotta look ready, even if we ain't doing much. Keeps the officers off our backs. Leaning against the wall, arms crossed, Mira, a female Marine with short brown hair, shot them both a disinterested glance. Yeah? Well, good luck with that. Captain Nezumi ain't even here. Won't be back for weeks. Jiro snorted. Oh yeah, his big inspection tour, right? More like a tax collection trip. Bet he's swimming in belly right about now, stuffing his pockets with all those protection fees from the islands. Kenta sighed. Must be nice. Just sail around, shake some people down, and call it work. Meanwhile, we're stuck here, cleaning rifles we ain't gonna fire and polishing cannons we ain't gonna shoot. Could be worse, Mira pointed out with a shrug. At least we're not on patrol duty. Heard the guys over at G2 had to chase off a Sea King last week. Jiro let out a laugh. Sea Kings, please. What do we get? A couple of seagulls stealing our rations and the occasional drunk fisherman making a scene? Kenta stretched, lacing his fingers behind his head. Honestly, I'd rather have it this way. As long as Captain Nezumi's gone, things stay peaceful. No stupid orders, no extra shifts. Just easy days and quiet nights. Mira gave a small smirk. Guess you got a point. Just gotta keep up the illusion of working till he gets back. The three shared a quiet chuckle before falling into a comfortable silence, the soft, repetitive sound of gun oil being rubbed into steel filling the air. After a while, Jiro spoke again, lowering his voice. You ever wonder where all the protection tax actually goes? Kenta scoffed, letting his broom drop against the floor. Come on, man. You know where it goes, straight into Nezumi's pockets. Mira rolled her eyes. Yeah, obviously. But still. We're Marines, aren't we? Shouldn't we, I don't know, do something about it? Jiro shot her a pointed look. You wanna end up floating face down in the harbor? That shut Mira up real quick. A heavy silence settled over them until Kenta finally broke it with a dry laugh. Yeah, no thanks. I like my head right where it is. Besides, as long as he's gone, we've got it easy. Just kick back, do the bare minimum, and act busy when the higher-ups come sniffing around. Mira shook her head but grinned. Fine, fine. But when he gets back, don't come crying when he decides to make an example out of someone. Jiro leaned back, folding his arms behind his head with a lazy smirk. That's future us's problem. Right now, we enjoy the peace. The air inside the barracks was still thick with lazy conversation and the rhythmic sound of half-hearted cleaning when a sudden boom echoed from outside. The wooden walls trembled slightly, followed by the unmistakable clamor of shouting Marines. Jiro's hand froze mid-wipe on the musket. You guys hear that? Kenta blinked, gripping his broom a little tighter. Nope. Didn't hear a thing. And if we don't hear it, we don't have to check it out. Mira groaned, already pushing herself off the wall. If we don't check it out, some officer's gonna come in here and make us do actual work. Let's go. The three reluctantly shuffled toward the entrance, their sluggish movements more fitting for men being dragged to their doom than soldiers responding to an emergency. As they stepped outside, their jaws collectively dropped at the scene before them. The training grounds, once a place of dull drills and occasional sparring matches, were now littered with groaning, unconscious Marines. Some were sprawled out in awkward positions, others piled on top of each other in what looked like an impromptu Marine tower of pain. And in the center of the chaos, two figures stood casually, as if they had just finished a light warm-up. One was a young man with green hair, 3 swords strapped to his waist, his arms folded with an expression that screamed, "This is barely worth my time." The other was a woman with short, dark blue hair, a sleek golden polearm with the glowing green spearhead, resting on her shoulder. Her expression was cool, almost bored, like she had just finished doing her morning stretches and was waiting for something interesting to happen. Jiro blinked several times. "Okay. Just to confirm, this is our base, right?" Mira smacked the back of his head. "Of course it's our base, idiot. Who the hell are these two?" A few other Marines from inside the base rushed out, forming a loose semicircle around the two intruders. One of them, a burly guy named Tetsuo, pointed an accusing finger at them. "Hey, you two? Do you even know this is a Marine base?" The green-haired swordsman shrugged. "Yeah, we do, but it doesn't really look like one." The blue-haired woman followed up. "Not like it mattered. Captain said to attack, so we did." Tetsuo's eye twitched. "That's it? That's your reason?" The two exchanged glances, as if trying to figure out if they were supposed to elaborate. "Nope," the swordsman finally said. The Marine squad collectively twitched, a vein popping on Tetsuo's forehead. "Are you kidding me?" Zoro scratched his head. "Look, if it makes you feel better, I don't even really know why he wanted us to attack." Kuina nodded. "Yeah, he just pointed in this direction and said, 'Go make a mess of things.' So here we are." Tetsuo and the other Marines had a brief moment of stunned silence before they all exploded at once. "That's just ridiculous. You can't just attack a Marine base 'cause your captain said so." "Who even is your captain?" Zoro yawned. "That's a lot of questions. You guys gonna fight, or are we just gonna stand here all day?" Tetsuo, now red in the face, clenched his fists. "Like hell we're letting you get away with this. Marines, get ready." Weapons were drawn, swords unsheathed, muskets cocked. The remaining conscious Marines prepared themselves, though a few of them glanced at the pile of already defeated comrades and gulped. Jiro sighed, shaking his head. "And here I thought today was gonna be an easy day." Mira grabbed a rifle, muttering under her breath. "Damn it, why did Captain Nezumi have to leave now of all times?" Kenta, who was still gripping his broom, hesitated. Does anyone else think maybe we should not fight the people who just wrecked half the base in, 5 minutes? No one paid attention to him. On the other side, Zoro cracked his neck, reaching for his swords. "Well, it doesn't look like a challenge, but at least it will be a decent warm-up guess." Kuina twirled her polearm, the ascended skyward spine humming faintly in the air. "Yeah, let's make this quick." The tension snapped as both sides rushed at each other. The first Marine to charge at Zoro let out a battle cry, swinging his cutlass down with all the force he could muster. Zoro didn't even bother drawing his swords. He barely tilted his head to the side, dodging with absurd ease. Before the Marine could even register his failure, Zoro slammed the hilt of his sword into the man's stomach. The Marine let out a choked oof before collapsing like a sack of potatoes. Two more came at him from opposite sides, hoping to overwhelm him. Zoro unsheathed his swords in a blur, the sound of steel ringing through the air. With a flick of his wrist, one blade caught an incoming strike, locking weapons with one attacker, while the other sword lashed out at the second Marine's legs. The unfortunate soldier were swept out from under him, landing hard on his back. Zoro barely spared him a glance before shifting his grip, wrenching the first Marine's weapon from his hands and sending it flying. Before his opponent could react, Zoro slammed the blunt side of his blade into the man's ribs, knocking him out instantly. Meanwhile, Kuina had launched herself into the fray. A Marine lunged at her with a spear, thrusting forward with the intent to skewer. Kuina spun her polearm with practiced ease, knocking the attack aside with a sharp clang. The force of the parry sent vibrations up the Marine's arms, and before he could recover, she twisted her weapon and slammed the shaft against his chest. He staggered backward, his breath leaving him in a sharp wheeze before he crumpled to the ground. Another Marine tried to take advantage of what he thought was an opening, moving to flank her. Big mistake. Without even turning, Kuina reversed her grip and drove the blunt end of her polearm backward. It connected squarely with his gut. The Marine let out a strangled gasp before his knees buckled, and he slumped forward, his body hitting the dirt with a dull thud. Jiro, who had reluctantly joined the fight, had just raised his sword when he saw yet another Marine soaring through the air courtesy of Zoro's boot. He took a moment to process what he was witnessing before making an executive decision. Yeah, nope. With all the grace of a seasoned professional, he immediately turned around and flopped onto the ground, dramatically pretending to be unconscious. Mira, meanwhile, was faring slightly better. She had managed to line up a shot at Kuina, taking careful aim before pulling the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the air, only for Kuina to casually flick her polearm and deflect the bullet mid-flight. Myra's jaw dropped as the bullet ricocheted harmlessly into a nearby barrel. Her eye twitched. That's not fair. Kuina smirked. I know. Kenta, still clutching his broom, stood frozen in place, trying very hard to look busy while avoiding actual combat. Tetsuo shot him a glare, and Kenta panicked, raising the broom like a spear. For justice. Then he promptly tripped over his own feet and face planted. Zoro, having just finished dealing with the last Marine foolish enough to rush him, surveyed the battlefield with an almost bored expression. That was fast. Kuina twirled her polearm one last time before resting it on her shoulder. Told you it wouldn't take long. The few remaining Marines, now realizing just how horrifically outmatched they were, exchanged nervous glances. Then, in a move that could only be described as blind desperation, they did the only thing that made sense to them. They charged together, yelling at the top of their lungs. Zoro sighed, already shifting his weight to cut them down when Kuina held up a hand. Wait, she said, gripping her spear a little tighter. I want to try the new move that came with this weapon. Zoro raised a brow but nodded, stepping back. Kuina took a deep breath, spinning the polearm in her hands. The weapon hummed with energy, the green spearhead glowing as wind began swirling around it. Let's see how it works against real people, she muttered, her grip tightening. Then, with a sharp thrust forward, she called out the attack. Gust surge. A translucent green tornado exploded from the spearhead, the force of the wind kicking up dust and debris. The charging Marines barely had time to scream before they were caught in the spiraling vortex. They were lifted off their feet, their bodies twisting helplessly as they were battered by the razor-sharp winds. For 10 agonizing seconds, they were tossed around like rag dolls before the tornado dissipated. When it was gone, the Marines lay sprawled across the ground, their eyes spinning in dizzy defeat. Deep cuts covered their bodies, their uniforms in tatters. As the dust settled, Kuina let out a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling. Damn. That takes a lot out of me, she muttered, wiping sweat from her forehead. I can only use it once every 15 minutes. Clicking her tongue, she hooked the polearm onto her back. Guess we should go tell the captain we're done here. The others should be finished by now, too. Zoro sheathed his swords and nodded. Without another word, the two turned and casually strolled out of the base. They left behind nothing but unconscious Marines, a few dazed survivors, and a lingering silence thick with disbelief. Jiro, still lying on the ground, cracked open one eye, surveying the devastation around him. He let out a quiet, resigned sigh. I am so transferring to a different branch. While Zoro and Kuina were busy dismantling the main forces of the base, the rest of the crew had their own tasks to handle. On a nearby hill, Uta lay prone, her sniper rifle resting steadily against her shoulder. Her keen eyes scanned the base, tracking every movement. She wasn't expecting trouble, not with Zoro and Kuina tearing through the Marines like a storm. But surprises had a nasty habit of showing up when least expected. And if anything unexpected did happen, she'd be ready to deal with it before it became a real problem for her crewmates who were inside. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Kaya and Reiju worked in perfect sync. Reiju took center stage, dressed in a marine uniform the crew had stashed away for occasions just like this. Playing the part flawlessly, she introduced herself as a visiting captain from the main branch, casually leaning against the counter as she flashed a charming smile at the kitchen staff. "You know," she purred, her voice dripping with intrigue, "I've always heard this base has some of the finest chefs in the Marines. Surely, you wouldn't mind treating a guest, would you?" The flattered chefs, eager to boast about their culinary stock, were completely unaware of Kaya slipping through the shadows behind them. Using the power of the cloak, Kaya moved like a whisper, unseen and unheard, as she made her way to the pantry. Once inside, she wasted no time, swiftly stuffing every bit of edible supplies she could get her hands on into a large sack. With how much food the crew went through, adding as much as to their supplies didn't hurt. While they raided the kitchen, Luffy had already cleaned out the armory. It wasn't much. The base wasn't exactly well equipped to begin with, and whatever weapons and ammunition they had were now stuffed into his inventory. He frowned, scanning the shelves one last time. No sea stone. He had expected as much, but that didn't make it any less disappointing. A small marine base like this wouldn't have much to begin with, and with a corrupt captain like Nezumi in charge, any sea stone that had ever been stored here had probably long since been sold off to the highest bidder. Probably Arlong, Luffy thought with a scowl. Still, there was one more place worth checking. With that in mind, he headed straight for the captain's office. A greedy rat like Nezumi would definitely have some valuable things stashed away, and as Luffy stepped inside, he took one look around and grinned. He wasn't disappointed. The moment he crossed the threshold, his nose wrinkled. If greed had a smell, this room would reek of it. Everything about the place screamed excess, from the gaudy gold-framed paintings lining the walls to the absurdly large chandelier overhead. The paintings were especially ridiculous. Half of them depicted Nezumi in exaggerated, self-glorifying poses, dressed in regal marine attire like some kind of hero. The rest were scenic landscapes and portraits of women in skimpy clothing, clearly chosen with no real taste beyond sheer indulgence. Luffy snorted. Man, this guy's got issues. The furniture wasn't any better. The desk in the center of the room was enormous, polished to such a glossy sheen that it practically sparkled under the light. The chairs, upholstered in deep red velvet, looked comically out of place in a marine base. And then there was the massive bookshelf against the far wall. Except it wasn't filled. Wow, after row of fine liquor bottles lined the shelves, their glass glistening like trophies. Luffy strolled further in, his gaze landing on the true prize. Behind the oversized captain's chair sat a massive silver-colored safe, its metallic surface gleaming in the dim light. Now that was interesting. Well, Luffy smirked, rubbing his chin as he stepped closer to the safe. What kind of goodies are you hiding? Nezumi, crouching down, he ran his fingers over the lock, studying it with mild curiosity. Raphael, scan the safe and see if you can decode the lock, he instructed. However, before Raphael could reply, Luffy's observation haki flared, alerting him to someone approaching the cabin. His brows lifted slightly as he focused. Despite the ongoing commotion outside, this person was heading straight for this room, moving with clear intent. But then something unexpected happened. The moment their haki signatures brushed against each other, a subtle clash rippled through his senses. Luffy's eyes widened slightly. A haki user? Here? In this part of the sea? And in a dump like this base? He mused, intrigued, as he waited for them to arrive. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a young woman with short vermilion hair and sharp brown eyes. She stepped inside with unwavering confidence, her expression neutral, not a hint of surprise on her face. As Luffy studied her more closely, he took note of the small band-aid on her left cheek and a fresh burn scar across the back of her hand. Signs that she had been in a heated encounter recently. The first thing the woman said, after scrutinizing Luffy for a moment, was, "You have haki." "So do you," Luffy replied easily, a grin tugging at his lips. "Name's Luffy, by the way. And you?" She held his gaze for a moment before finally responding. "Asuka, former ensign, and current chore girl of the 16th branch," she added bitterly, her voice laced with barely restrained anger. She took a slow, measured breath, regaining her composure before continuing. "It looks like you're interested in that safe." "That I am," Luffy admitted, sparing the silver safe a glance. His fingers twirled the green crystal dagger that had materialized in his grip. Are you here to stop me? I should, shouldn't I? Asuka chuckled dryly, though her eyes remained sharp as they returned to his. But I have no intention of doing so. In fact, I'll even give you the code to crack it open. She raised a hand before he could question her motives. In return, you'll do one thing for me. Back on the ship, Uda was the last to return after ensuring no one had been left behind. As she stepped aboard, she immediately noticed something unusual. The crew, except for Kaya, was casually sitting on the deck, enjoying a fresh meal. Meanwhile, Luffy stood outside the girls' room, leaning against the wall, his gaze fixed on the ground with an uncharacteristically serious expression. Reiju, noticing Uda's arrival, raised a hand with a smirk. Uda, look at all this fresh food. I hated having to flirt and act all sleazy with those chefs, but I guess this is decent compensation. Yeah, it looks good, Uda said, grabbing a piece of bread and taking a bite. But her eyes drifted back to Luffy. By the way, what's up with him? Did something happen during the raid? Well, Kuina started, but before she could answer, Kaya's voice suddenly called out from inside the girls' room. Luffy, I'm done checking on the patient, she's decent now. The moment those words left Kaya's mouth, Luffy pushed off the wall and stepped inside without hesitation. His eagerness didn't go unnoticed, and curiosity sparked among the rest of the crew. Sharing glances, they quickly got up and followed him into the room. As they stepped inside, their eyes fell on the frail young woman lying on the bed. She had ginger hair and brown eyes, but her condition was alarming. Her skin was stretched taut over her bones, her face completely drained of color, and her once vibrant hair was dull and lifeless. What struck them even harder was the realization that this was after Kaya's treatment. If she still looked this bad now, none of them could even begin to imagine how horrific her state had been before. Luffy's gaze darkened as he took in the sight before turning to Kaya, who looked visibly drained from the effort of healing the girl. He crouched beside her, gently taking her hand in his. You alright? He asked softly. Kaya let out a tired breath but managed a small smile. Yeah, I'm good, she reassured him, though the exhaustion in her voice was evident. It just took more out of me than I expected to stabilize her. But then her expression darkened. Luffy, it was worse than you said, she murmured, her grip tightening. Broken bones, deep fractures, whip marks across her back, and, she paused, taking a shaky breath as a surge of anger welled up inside her. Luffy, whoever did this to her is a monster. Her voice trembled with barely restrained fury, and her eyes burned with unshed tears. There was so much damage that just repairing it drained me, and I still haven't even healed the whip wounds on her back. A tear slipped down her cheek. Without hesitation, Luffy pulled her into a comforting hug. She buried her face in his chest, her body trembling slightly as she let the emotions wash over her. Meanwhile, the others listening to her were stunned by her report. They didn't know who this girl was, where Luffy had found her, or why he had brought her aboard the ship. But seeing Kaya's condition and the fury burning in Luffy's eyes, they knew it had to be something serious. A moment later, Kaya took a deep breath, steadying herself as she lifted her head. Her pained eyes met Luffy's, and in a hushed whisper meant only for him, she murmured, Luffy, your fear was right. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. There are signs of, her breath hitched, the words catching in her throat. But I can't say anything for sure. Luffy clenched his fists, forcing himself to take deep, steadying breaths. The quiet storm in his eyes was enough to make the rest of the crew uneasy. They had never seen him like this before. Reiju, take Kaya to my room and make sure she gets some rest, he ordered, his voice firm but gentle. Stay with her. Reiju nodded without question, guiding a weary Kaya out of the room. Then Luffy turned to Zoro. Zoro, Kuina. Get the ship moving. No more stops, no more rests. We're heading straight to Kokoyashi village. The tension in his voice left no room for argument. The crew immediately sprang into action, understanding that their captain wasn't in the mood for jokes or questions. Once the room was empty, Luffy let out a slow exhale before turning to Uda. Without a word, he stepped forward and pulled her into a tight embrace. Uda froze for a second, caught off guard, but then softened. She rested her chin on his shoulder and patted his back in quiet reassurance. A moment later, he pulled away and sighed. Thanks, I needed that, he admitted, offering her a small, grateful smile. I understand, Uda said, taking his hand in hers and giving it a firm squeeze. "Luffy, what's going on? Who is this girl?" Luffy hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Then, with a decisive nod, he made up his mind. "This." He glanced back at the unconscious girl on the bed before looking Uta in the eye. "This is Nami from Kokoyashi village. And from what I've been told, she's the best thief in the East Blue." To be continued. A flashback chapter featuring Luffy and Asuka. Raphael system. A few hours ago, during the raid on the 16th branch, Luffy agreed to Asuka's terms. He'd do one thing for her in exchange for the code to open Captain Nezumi's safe. Once they shook on it, Asuka input the code and swung the safe open. Just as Luffy had expected, it was crammed full of bellies and glittering piles of jewelry. Without wasting a second, he swept everything into his inventory. Every last coin, gem, and golden trinket. He also grabbed a few paintings, specifically the ones that didn't feature Nezumi's smug, punchable face, and several bottles of high-end liquor he knew Zoro would be thrilled to get his hands on. Then he paused, shrugged, and, because why not, added the expensive furniture, and the massive silver safe itself. Asuka watched in disbelief as the room was stripped of nearly everything valuable. "Why don't you just take the walls and ceiling while you're at it, huh?" she snapped, one eye twitching in irritation. What little he'd left behind was nothing but trash, gaudy, tasteless junk plastered with Nezumi's ugly mug. Honestly, that offended her more than the looting itself. "And how the hell are you even doing that? Stuff just poof. Gone," she added, throwing her hands up in disbelief. "It's just one of my many talents," Luffy replied with a grin and a nonchalant wave. "Anyway, now that I'm done here, how about we move on to that one thing you wanted?" Asuka's demeanor shifted in an instant. Her expression turned serious as she gave a short nod. "Follow me." She turned and exited the room, Luffy falling into step behind her. But as they stepped into the hallway, she abruptly stopped and glanced toward the far corner, her brow furrowing. Luffy followed her gaze, a mischievous glint in his eye. "What, need to take care of it?" Asuka didn't look at him. "No need, I don't care," she said coolly, and with that, she continued down the hall, walking toward their destination. As they neared their destination, Luffy's brows knit together in a frown. The path ahead led unmistakably toward the underground prisoners' dungeon. If not for his observation Haki assuring him there was no ambush lying in wait, he might have assumed this was a setup. Still, his instincts kept him tense, his body primed to unleash crystalline hell at a moment's notice. Asuka noticed the subtle change in his posture, the way his shoulders squared and his gaze sharpened. But she said nothing. She knew he could sense it wasn't a trap, and deep down, she trusted he wasn't the kind of man to stab someone in the back. When they stepped into the dungeon, Luffy gave the place a quick once-over and scoffed. It was practically deserted. The cells were empty, the air stale and stagnant, with only the faintest trace of life lingering far off at the end of the corridor. He wasn't surprised. A weasel like Nezumi wouldn't waste effort locking up criminals. Not when he could take bribes and let them roam free. And if he ever needed to scare a population into submission, a few civilian casualties would do the trick just fine. Who needed a functioning prison when fear was cheaper and easier? "So," Luffy said, stepping up beside her, "mind telling me why you're still stuck in this shithole?" "That's none of your business," Asuka shot back, her voice sharp. "I was just making conversation," Luffy said with a shrug. "Someone like you with at least a basic grasp of Haki could be way more useful in Paradise. Or even stationed in Logia Town, instead of wasting a logia there." "There's no need to slander Captain Smoker," she snapped, eyes narrowing. "He's doing a fine job crushing the new pirates coming out of the East Blue." "Yeah, sure. Real impressive job taking down a bunch of greenhorns. Most of them haven't even seen a devil fruit, let alone a damn logia," Luffy replied, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "But hey, at least he's helping keep up the East Blue's reputation as the weakest of the four seas." "It's not just him," Asuka countered, her tone turning defensive but tinged with pride. "You forget about marine hero Garp. The East Blue is his hometown, you know. He goes back and forth between here and the Grand Line, and every time, he wipes out whatever pirate he comes across." Luffy cast a sideways glance her way, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You sure seem to know a lot about Garp." Not really, she replied, her tone cooling again. I just overheard Vice Admiral Suru chewing someone out back at the training camp. They were pissed about being stationed in the East Blue, she added, her expression darkening as Suru's face flashed through her mind. She told us that, as Marines, we sometimes have to stomach bitter experiences without losing sight of what really matters. What the true mission of the Marines is, she said, the words laced with venom. Back then, I didn't understand what she meant, but now I do. Luffy chuckled softly. Oh yeah? Sounds like you've had some real eye-openers. He tilted his head toward her, eyes gleaming with interest. Wanna share? I'm all ears. No, thank you, Asuka said curtly. Besides, we're here. Finally, they reached the far end of the corridor and came to a stop in front of the only cell that radiated even the faintest trace of life. Luffy stepped forward, peering inside, and what he saw made his blood run cold. All the cheer drained from his face in an instant. His eyes widened, mouth parting slightly in disbelief, a hollow sort of horror sinking into his gut. Inside the cell, chained to the wall by thick iron shackles, was Nami. Her arms were raised above her head, wrists rubbed raw from the heavy restraints. She looked nothing like the vibrant, fiery navigator he remembered from his previous life. Her body was emaciated, skin ghostly pale beneath the dim torchlight. Her breaths came shallow and uneven, and her eyelids fluttered like she was teetering on the edge of unconsciousness. Every now and then, she stirred slightly, just enough to prove she was barely alive. Seeing her like this sent a violent surge of rage boiling up in Luffy's chest, especially as memories of Nami's sunny smile flashed unbidden through his mind, which felt a world away from the frail figure shackled before him. But he forced himself to stay calm. Blowing up at Asuka wouldn't help, and deep down, he knew this world didn't align perfectly with the one he remembered. There were too many inconsistencies, and he needed answers before jumping to conclusions. Still, seeing Nami like this had already snapped something deep inside him, and someone was going to pay for this. Unaware of the storm raging beneath Luffy's calm exterior, Asuka sighed and looked toward the girl in the cell, her expression darkening with a flicker of regret. That's Nami, she said quietly, folding her arms across her chest. Some poor girl from Kokoyashi village. I don't know all the details, but from what I've pieced together from gossip around the base, Nezumi threw her in here about 3 months ago with no official charges. 3 months. Luffy muttered, taking another steadying breath. That's why I want to hire you, Asuka said, her voice firmer now, trying to meet the weight in his silence. Break her out. Take her home. Back to Kokoyashi. That's all I'm asking. She turned to him, expecting a nod, maybe a smug reply. Instead, she was hit by the sheer force of fury burning in his eyes. The look startled her for a split second, but then she found herself quietly relieved. At least the boy standing in front of her still had enough humanity left to feel something for the girl in that cell. You've already been paid, she added, trying to regain control of the conversation. Just get her home safely. That's all. That's all, huh? He repeated, shaking his head with a low, bitter laugh with no humor behind it. Sure, I'll take her back to Kokoyashi. But then what? When your precious captain comes back and finds the cell empty, where do you think he'll go first? He won't be looking for me. He'll go straight to her. He might not stop at just throwing her in another cage. Maybe he makes an example out of her. Maybe someone else in that village pays the price. So tell me, Luffy continued, his voice colder now. How exactly do you plan to protect her then? What are you going to do when that mouse-faced bastard comes storming in with a squad of Marines and the full weight of his rank behind him? Asuka stammered, caught off guard. But then a thought struck her. I could have him removed from his post. I know someone high up at headquarters. And what if you don't? Luffy pressed, stepping toward her, eyes locked on hers with quiet intensity. What if your contact ignores you? What if they drag their feet or decide it's not worth the trouble? Would you stand against Nezumi then? Would you raise your sword against another Marine if that's what it took to protect an innocent? Something shifted in her gaze, the hesitation melting away under the weight of his question. Anger flickered across her face, not at him, but at the reality he'd forced her to confront. She met his eyes without flinching and stepped forward. You think I chose to be a chore girl in this corrupt, rotting base? She asked, her voice taut with frustration. I've raised my sword against a fellow Marine once, and for the right cause, I'd do it again. Luffy studied her for a moment, then a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, wry, but sincere. He clapped a hand on her shoulder, his tone softer now. I knew I had a good feeling about you. You got guts, I'll give you that. Why don't you come with me? I could use a feisty personality like you on my crew. No thanks, Asuka said, brushing his hand off and rolling her eyes. I'm happy right where I am. Your loss, Luffy said with a shrug, though the amusement never quite left his voice. His expression then turned serious again as he turned back toward the cell. Now then. Let's get Nami out of this hellhole. Asuka nodded silently at Luffy's command and reached for the keys to Nami's cell, but before she could slide one into the lock, a sharp clinking sound cut through the stagnant air of the dungeon. With a startled jerk, she turned just in time to see the cell bars clatter to the floor in a clean heap of severed iron. She turned and saw Luffy standing in front of the cell, one hand extended and a crystalline dagger gleaming faintly in his grasp as he stepped calmly over the fallen bars and into the cell. A moment later, he was in front of Nami. The closer he got, the more his expression darkened. Every step revealed another wound, another bruise, another silent cry etched into her skin. Her wrists were red and raw from the heavy shackles. Her legs trembled weakly, unable to support her weight even if they'd been free. Cuts, some fresh, some barely scabbed over, ran across her arms and collarbone. She looked half alive, somewhere between a fading dream and a lingering nightmare. The sight clawed at Luffy's composure like barbed wire. His rage, which had been simmering under the surface, now surged up like a wave crashing against the inside of his skull. Each injury, each scar, told a story he didn't want to hear. And each detail fueled the growing fire in his gut with an overwhelming urge to strangle that mouse-faced bastard even more. Asuka, help me out, Luffy said, his voice rough but steady as he knelt beside Nami. His eyes never left her bruised frame. Hold her still while I cut the restraints. In her condition, even the wrong angle could snap a bone. Without hesitation, Asuka dropped to her knees beside him. Carefully, she slipped one arm beneath Nami's shoulders and the other beneath her knees, cradling her as gently as if she were made of glass. Got it, she said softly. With quiet precision, Luffy brought the dagger to the chains, slicing through iron links as though they were paper, and a moment later, a few soft clicks echoed through the chamber as the last shackle fell away. The moment she was free, Luffy dismissed the dagger and pulled a soft blanket from his inventory. He draped it over Nami's fragile frame, tucking it gently around her before slipping his arms beneath her and lifting her into a princess carry. She felt weightless, far too light for his liking. As he held her close, she stirred faintly against his chest. Her lips moved without force, barely forming words. But he caught them, soft, slurred whispers clinging to fading consciousness. She was calling out for Belle-Mere. And for Najiko. Luffy's grip tightened slightly as he looked down at her pale face. I've got you now, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Luffy, this is where we part ways, Asuka said, halting just outside the cell. Her voice was steady, but there was a weariness underneath it. I'm ready to face the consequences for what I've done here, but the longer I can keep our alliance off the record, the better. For both our sakes. Luffy paused, shifting Nami slightly in his arms to glance back at her. I get it, he said with a nod, his tone neither disappointed nor surprised. Still, you sure you don't want to reconsider my offer? Someone like you could go far with us. Asuka's lips tightened, her expression unreadable. She didn't answer immediately. Vice Admiral Suru's teachings echoed in her head like ghosts. Finally, she met his eyes and shook her head. No I don't, she said, firm now. Then, with a hint of playful defiance curling her lips, she added, and next time we meet, we might be enemies. So don't expect me to go easy on you, with a teasing wink. Luffy chuckled, a low sound that carried a surprising warmth. Then I guess I'd better step up my training, he replied. He turned to leave, but after a few steps, something changed. Asuka felt it immediately, an invisible shift in the air, like pressure dropping before a storm. The warmth was gone. In its place, a chill that prickled against the skin. Luffy stopped, his back to her, and when he spoke again, his voice was razor sharp. By the way, he said, slow and deliberate, if I ever run into Nezumi again, I'm going to kill him, slowly. The venom in his voice made the hairs on Asuka's neck rise. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, delivered with ice-cold clarity. She hesitated, then drew in a slow breath. "I won't stop you," she said at last. "But you do realize what that means, right? If you kill a Marine captain, the higher-ups will cover for him. His crimes will vanish from the records, and you'll be hunted personally with an agenda to avenge one of our own." There was no hesitation in Luffy's response. Only scorn. "Wow," he scoffed. "You say that with a straight face and still choose to stay loyal to people who'd rather cover up filth than clean it." His gaze narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in disappointment. "You keep talking about justice, but you're still wearing the same uniform as the man who tortured this girl." Asuka looked away, her jaw tightening. She wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Suru's ideals, once her guiding star, now felt more like chains. Her silence stretched out, heavy and bitter. Luffy looked forward again. "Anyway, I'm fine with being hunted. If sticking to my principles means becoming the villain in someone else's story, so be it. And in my opinion, anyone who'd hurt an innocent girl like this doesn't deserve to live." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Asuka let out a breath, a dry laugh slipping from her lips. "You know, Luffy, why don't you come with me?" she said, half serious. "The Marines could use someone principled and passionate like you." He turned just slightly, enough for her to catch the smirk tugging at his mouth. "No thanks. I'm happy right where I am," he said, echoing her earlier words with a lightness that made her eyes narrow in reluctant amusement. Then, without another word, he turned again and began walking away. But after a few steps, he stopped once more. This time, he didn't turn. His voice came over his shoulder, calm but laden with something heavier than rage. "Oh, and Asuka, it wasn't Pirate's Village." The words hit her like a slap. He continued, voice steady but laced with quiet weight. "It was Vice Admiral Draw, and if you don't believe me, ask your old instructor. She might have the answers you've been looking for." Then he walked away for good, carrying Nami in his arms, the soft blanket still wrapped tightly around her. Asuka, on the other hand, stood frozen, a dozen memories crashing into her all at once. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, her mind spinning as Suru's face and teachings blurred together with the cries of her parents and the village lost to fire. "And that's what happened," Luffy said as he looked around at his crew. It was late into the night following the raid, and everyone was gathered on the deck, seated in a loose circle beneath the stars, listening as Luffy explained how he'd ended up rescuing Nami, who was still unconscious, resting in the girls' quarters. "Damn. I knew the Marines were but this." Uda muttered, her voice low with disgust. Her fists were clenched tightly in her lap, and her expression was sharp with fury. But when she looked back at Luffy, some of that edge softened. "You did the right thing, taking her in." "Yeah," Kuina added, her arms crossed as she leaned back against the mast, scowling. "But someone's gotta make that bastard pay. For what he did to her. For what he's probably done to who knows how many other girls." "Don't worry," Luffy said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sea stretched out before them, dark and endless. "He'll get what's coming to him, sooner than he thinks." Reiju tilted her head, one brow raised. "You're talking about Kokoyashi village, aren't you?" she asked. "You really think, out of all the islands under the 16th branch's jurisdiction, he's going to show up there?" "I do," Luffy answered without hesitation. He turned slightly, a small but knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Call it intuition. Or maybe something more. Either way, I've got my reasons. And I think the pieces are already moving. That mouse-faced bastard's fate is going to bring him straight to his doom." Zoro let out a snort and tipped back a flask of wine he'd looted from Nezumi's personal stash. "You really believe in something as dumb as fate?" he asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's next? You gonna tell us you're a god sent to liberate the world?" Luffy burst into laughter, the sound echoing off the waves and into the night. No, I'm no god," he said between chuckles, shaking his head at the irony. "But I do think that fate has a wicked sense of humor and brings interesting people together in interesting places to spice up the world." His crew smiled, some more skeptically than others, but the tension that had lingered since the dungeon story eased just a little. After that, they chatted for a little while longer before one by one, the crew peeled away to their quarters or their posts, leaving the deck quiet once more. All except for Zoro, who remained leaning against the railing beside Luffy, arms folded and his expression unreadable. The swordsman was unusually quiet, staring out at the moonlit sea with a thoughtful frown. "Something on your mind?" Luffy asked, glancing up from where he sat. Zoro took a moment before responding, scratching the back of his head. "Yeah. How did you know it was a marine who burned down that girl's village?" Luffy blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Wait, how do you know I said that?" he asked slowly. "I don't remember telling anyone." Zoro just shrugged, entirely nonchalant. "We all saw it in the flashback." "You saw it?" "In the flashback?" Luffy repeated, each word slower than the last. He stared at Zoro, trying to determine if he was joking, but Zoro's face was as serious as ever. Luffy sighed heavily and ran a hand down his face. "Zoro, for the love of God, stop breaking the fourth wall." Zoro raised an eyebrow. "What wall?" Luffy groaned. "If you keep this up, that stupid meme's gonna come true. You'll wander off during a toilet break and end up in Naruto or Attack on Titan. And then I'll have to waste a whole damn side story just to go drag your mossy ass back." Zoro blinked once. "That explains the talking raccoon with the huge ass gun I passed last week." Luffy stared at him in horror. "What?" But Zoro had already turned away, casually taking a swig from the wine he'd pilfered from Nezumi's stash. "Anyway, I'm gonna get some sleep. Wake me when it's my turn to watch the ship," he said, already strolling off like none of the bizarre conversation had happened. Luffy watched him go, face in his hands. "I swear, one of these days, I'm just going to put a GPS tracker on that idiot." It had been 2 days since Luffy and his crew raided the 16th branch, and in that time, Asuka had barely left her quarters. She kept herself locked away, avoiding the others on base. Not that anyone noticed or cared, since the entire outpost was steeped in silent dread, each marine more concerned with their own fate than the absence of one newly arrived choregirl. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable. Nezumi's return and the storm of fury he'd bring with him once he discovered the wreckage left behind. But none of that mattered to Asuka. Not when her mind had been consumed by one sentence that refused to let go of her. "It wasn't pirates who burned down your village. It was Vice Admiral Draw." Luffy's words hadn't just surprised her, they had shattered the foundation of everything she believed in. And the worst part was, it made sense. Logically, it made sense. She had seen Draw's reckless disregard for civilian lives firsthand during that infamous battle against Fire Fist Ace. That incident was the very reason she had been demoted to this dumpster of a base, because she had dared to prioritize saving civilians and called out Draw's reckless actions, questioned the needless destruction he caused, and in doing so, unknowingly bruised the ego of a powerful man. What made it all worse, the part that still twisted like a knife in her gut, was that Ace, the so-called pirate, had fought to protect the civilians alongside her. While Draw rained destruction on friend and foe alike, it was Ace who shielded the innocent. It was the pirate who showed more justice than the Marine. And yet, despite everything, despite the logic, the memories, the buried suspicions, her heart still refused to accept it. The man who had once saved her life, the man whose back she had followed into battle, whose ideals she had believed in so fiercely, could he truly be the one who had destroyed her home? Could the very person she had admired all these years be the reason she had no family to return to? And then there was Luffy. A stranger. A pirate. Someone she had never met before that day, and yet he had spoken with absolute certainty about the darkest truth of her life. How could he have possibly known? How could he understand something she had spent years trying to bury? But that question, like so many others, was quickly swept away by the storm raging inside her. Doubt. Grief. Confusion. Rage. The truths she had believed in were crumbling, and she needed answers soon before losing her mind. Finally, she made up her mind and decided to heed Luffy's advice. She crossed her room, pulled out a small den mushi she had swiped from one of the administrative offices shortly after being assigned to the base, and set it on the desk. For several minutes, she just stood there, staring at the snail phone in silence as her fingers hovered over the dial, then retreated, then hovered again. Finally, she took a deep breath, steeled her nerves, and punched in the number. After a few seconds, a familiar voice answered on the other end. "This is Marine Vice Admiral Suru. Who is this?" "Hello, Instructor Suru." It's Asuka, she replied, struggling to keep her voice even to sound composed. Oh dear, it's you, came the older woman's warm, familiar voice. There was a touch of concern in it, laced with affection. How are you holding up? I imagine things are a bit less Chan the Grand Line. Yes. It's been quiet, Asuka said, though her thoughts were anything but. The words she had spent days preparing scattered the moment she heard Suru's voice. The old marine had raised her students like her own children, part mentor, part mother, part friend. And now, asking a question that could shatter that image made her hesitate. For the first time in a long while, she was afraid. I understand, dear. And don't worry, I've been pushing for your reinstatement. But the complaint Vice Admiral Draw filed against you is thorough, Suru sighed. He claims your actions directly allowed Fire Fist Ace to escape. Under normal circumstances, it might not have carried so much weight, but Ace being one of Whitebeard's commanders, that's what made the situation much more serious on your end. I was saving civilians, Asuka snapped, emotion cracking through her voice. Doesn't that mean anything anymore? Calm down, dear, Suru said gently, though her tone grew a little firmer. I know where you're coming from, I do. And believe me, you're not being condemned for saving lives. But not everyone sees things through that lens. To the higher-ups, your decision compromised a golden opportunity to capture a high-value target. And that's what turned the tide against you. Asuka closed her eyes, feeling the lump in her throat grow heavier. I see, she whispered, gripping the receiver so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her voice trembled as she asked, Instructor Suru, please be honest with me. What's your personal opinion of what I did that day? The line went silent for a long, heavy moment. When Suru finally spoke, her voice had softened to a quiet murmur. Asuka, as your former instructor, I'm proud of you. You followed your conscience and chose to protect the innocent. That takes strength. But as your superior officer, I'm disappointed. You had a chance to assist in capturing a key figure in the world's most dangerous pirate crew, and you let that chance slip through your fingers. You could have helped neutralize the threat first, then turned to the civilians. I respect your heart, truly. But in this job, sometimes a few lives are considered an acceptable loss when weighed against the capture of someone like Ace. That's the brutal truth of it. I understand, Asuka said softly. Her tone suddenly became flat, almost eerily calm, like the eye of a storm. There was a long pause. Then, without emotion, she added, but tell me something, Vice Admiral Suru. Who really burned down my village? To be continued. Under whipping fire, Raphael. System. But tell me something, Vice Admiral Suru. Who really burned down my village? On the other end of the line, Suru froze, immediately picking up on the shift in how her student was addressing her. She exhaled slowly, her voice carefully measured as she responded, Asuka, where is this coming from? It's been years since the tragedy at your village. Why dredge up old wounds now? Thank you for your concern, Vice Admiral Suru, Asuka replied, her tone sharp, stripped of any real gratitude. But recently, I stumbled across some information. Something I never expected. That's why I'm asking you now. I need to hear the truth from you. I want to believe I can trust you. There was a long pause before Suru answered, her age seeming to weigh heavily on her in that moment. I see. So that's how it is, she murmured, her voice heavy with regret. You've already pieced it together, haven't you? So it's true. Asuka's voice cracked slightly as she gripped the receiver of her Den Den Mushi with white-knuckled fingers. It wasn't pirates who burned down my home. It was Vice Admiral Draw, and he just walked away from it. I understand your anger, Asuka, Suru said gently, though even she could hear the hollow ring to her own words. But you have to see the bigger picture. That tragedy took your parents from you, yes. But it also forged you into the woman you are today. Strong, capable. Someone who can protect others from facing the same horrors. That's not the point. Asuka's voice rose sharply, emotion breaking through before she forced herself to reel it back in. She took a shaky breath and continued, her voice cold but steady, I'm not asking for a silver lining. I'm asking why. Why was he never punished? How can we preach about justice to the world when we cover up crimes like his? I'll be blunt with you. Yes, headquarters was fully aware of the truth behind the tragedy at your village, Suru said, dropping all pretense of kindness. Her voice was no longer that of a mentor or a friend. It was the cold, seasoned tone of a veteran and a superior officer. However, Vice Admiral Draw succeeded in eliminating the pirates stationed there. Revealing his error, or punishing him for it, would have dealt a heavy blow to Marine morale and tarnished our reputation. If you're asking why, the answer is simple. In the Marines, we value soldiers who are effective and swift. Soldiers who don't hesitate in the face of duty. She paused just long enough for her words to sink in before continuing. Vice Admiral Draw, for all his brutality and lack of finesse, has always delivered results. Then and now, he remains one of our highest performing officers when it comes to mission success rates. That's why, even if I personally dislike his reckless, aggressive ways, I certainly do appreciate their effectiveness. That's why, Suru's voice hardened even further, a dangerous glint hidden behind her words. Before you act on whatever emotions you're feeling right now, you need to stop and think. Think about the life you've built for yourself. Weigh it carefully in your heart, and decide if vengeance is really worth destroying everything you've worked so hard to achieve. I'll keep that in mind, Asuka said flatly. She didn't wait for a response, she simply ended the call. As the line went dead, Asuka collapsed onto her bed, the Den Den Mushi slipping from her hand and landing with a soft thud on the floor. Pressing her face into her pillow, she let out silent, aching sobs, the kind that seemed to hollow her out from the inside. Everything she believed in, her mentors, her cause, her pride, felt like it was crumbling away, leaving her clutching at the shattered remains of a life that suddenly felt like a lie. Meanwhile, back in her office, Suru stared silently at the Den Den Mushi for a long, heavy moment. Her shoulders sagged under a weight she rarely allowed herself to show. After what felt like an eternity, she reached out, dialed another number, and waited. After a few rings, the other end picked up. "Hello, my dear granddaughter. How are you?" Suru asked, forcing a small, warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. After a cheerful response, Suru's voice grew serious. "You're still in East Blue, right?" She nodded when she heard confirmation. "Good. Listen carefully. I need you to make your way immediately to the 16th branch. I have a very important mission for you." 2 days later, every Marine stationed at the 16th branch stood in rigid silence within the courtyard of their base. The air was heavy with unease. Their heads bowed in shame or discomfort as they faced two rear admirals, answering questions about the recent raid that had rocked their branch, which had left both the base and their pride in disarray. In front of them, Rear Admiral Kujaku stood tall, her posture relaxed, but the fire in her narrowed eyes betrayed the calm mask on her face. The bright sun beat down on the 16th branch base, but it was the weight of Kujaku's piercing glare that made the Marines sweat more than the heat ever could. Her hands were folded neatly behind her back, gripping her coiled whip, and when she finally spoke, her cold voice cut through the courtyard like a blade. "I was under the impression the Marine Academy taught you discipline, tactics, combat effectiveness," she said, her tone dangerously even. "But after hearing about what happened here, I have to ask, did you sleep through those classes and spend your time snoring in the barracks instead?" Her words echoed sharply through the courtyard. No one dared to raise their head. Some shifted awkwardly in place, others stiffened further. The silence lingered like a blade hanging over their heads. "You mean to tell me two intruders, just two, broke into your base, humiliated the lot of you, and walked out without so much as a bruise? You outnumbered them at least 10 to 1? Her voice rose suddenly, cracking through the air like thunder. Several Marines flinched, some visibly swallowing down panic as the sting of her words hit harder than any blow. "And still, you got flattened like a bunch of fresh cadets on their first day of training." A trembling voice broke the silence. "Ma'am, with all due respect," said Jiro, his voice barely holding steady. "The 16th branch doesn't usually see much action. It's a quiet post. We don't exactly have high-threat targets out here. We weren't ready." He didn't get to finish. Kujaku's eyes gleamed with fury, and with a sharp flick of her wrist, her whip lashed the ground just inches from Jiro's boots. The crack of leather against stone made him yelp and stumble back, his face pale with fear. "Not ready?" she echoed, curling the whip back into her hand with practiced ease. "Let me make something absolutely clear, Marine. Readiness isn't something you put on hold until it's convenient. It's not a suggestion. It is the bare minimum expected of you the moment you wear that uniform. If you're standing under this flag," she gestured sharply toward the ruined wall behind her, where the Marine standard lay torn and dirtied on the ground, "then you should be ready to protect it or die trying. Or would you rather wait for the next group of so-called nobodies to stroll through your gates and turn this base into a playground again? You weren't defeated because you were caught off guard. You were defeated because you let yourselves grow weak, because you got complacent, because you convinced yourselves that this was some cushy backwater assignment where you could slack off and let your skills decay." Kujiku's voice dropped to a cold hiss. "Well, congratulations. Now the whole world knows just how many cowards and fools we've stacked into this command." Kujiku stepped back and addressed the entire unit once more. "From now on, daily drills will be doubled. Tactical re-evaluations begin tomorrow. You'll be trained like you're going to war, because clearly, that's the only way to snap you out of this pathetic complacency. And until I see improvement." Pay attention to the kitchen staff, taking slow, deliberate steps toward them. "I'll keep this short, because frankly, I'm not sure I can stomach the full story again without losing faith in the combined intelligence of you all," she said, her voice laced with disappointment and disgust. One woman, wearing a clearly fake captain's jacket 2 sizes too big and lipstick thick enough to stop a bullet, struts into your kitchen, bats her eyes, purrs something vaguely official, and not one of you thought to verify her identity? She spun on her heel and pointed directly at the trembling cook who had led the kitchen crew that day. "And your response is to drop your pans and serve her whatever she wants." Ma'am, she said she was from G2, that it was a random check," the cook stammered, face flushing red as his fellow chefs nodded in desperate agreement. She had the insignia and was wearing a proper, real uniform, and then she smiled and, well. She smiled, Kujiku repeated flatly, cutting him off with pure disdain. "And that was enough to make half of you fall over yourselves like lovesick schoolboys? While the rest of her crew helped themselves to every ration, crate, and bottle not bolted to the floor?" She raised a hand and summoned a seaman first class who stepped forward, holding a clipboard. Kujiku snatched it, eyes skimming the inventory report. 2 months' worth of food. Gone. 40 crates of provisions. Gone. 6 barrels of preserved meats. Gone. Even the bloody spices, gone. She slapped the clipboard against the cook's chest, hard enough to make him stagger. Did it never occur to you geniuses that maybe a real Marine captain wouldn't flirt her way into a kitchen like a pirate on shore leave? Or that actual officers don't schedule surprise inspections by whispering, "Hey, cutie," while twirling a strand of hair? No one dared answer. One of the younger kitchen assistants looked like he wanted to disappear into his apron. Kujiku let the silence drag before turning her back to them. "You failed to protect a critical supply division of a Marine base because your hearts fluttered at the first sign of attention. Pathetic." She took a few steps forward, then paused. Her voice dropped an octave, tone deadly calm. "From this day forward, every member of the kitchen staff will attend deception recognition training. Twice a week. You'll be drilled on infiltration tactics, uniform verification procedures, and how not to get honey trapped by the first pretty face that walks through your door. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Rear Admiral," the kitchen staff shouted in unison, their voices hoarse but terrified. "Good. Maybe next time someone flashes you a smile, you'll remember what division you serve under before handing them the pantry keys." Her eyes flicked coldly back to the head cook. "And next time, if someone's waistline doesn't match their rank, try using your upper head, before your lower one gets you court-martialed." Then Kujiku turned her attention to the final, and most significant, target of her fury. This wasn't just another faceless Marine to lecture. No, this woman was different. Not only did she have the rank and skill to stop the intruders, but she was also someone Kujiku's own grandmother had specifically warned her to keep an eye on. And after everything Kujiku had learned upon arriving at the 16th branch, her blood was already at a rolling boil. "And finally, you," she said coldly, turning to face Asuka, who stood at the back with her arms folded and her expression unreadable. She hadn't said a word during the entire dressing down, hadn't even flinched, but now Kujiku's gaze was squarely fixed on her. "I've been hearing some very interesting things about you from a variety of sources." "I see," Asuka responded, her voice even and cool, bordering on indifferent. "That's all you have to say?" Kujiku snapped, her composure cracking as she marched a step closer. her whip rattling at her side. "I've reviewed your file. Your assignments, your field reports, your combat record. Everything. There's no way in hell someone with your experience couldn't have stopped a couple of intruders from the damn East Blue." "Oh, is that so?" Asuka replied with a faint shrug, voice dry with amusement. "Well, that's unfortunate. I was busy doing my own thing while the base got looted." "Doing what, exactly?" Kujaku demanded, the venom rising in her voice. "Conspiring with the raiders." "That's right, ma'am. I saw her," one of the younger Marines suddenly shouted, desperate to redirect attention from himself. "She was talking to one of the guys who hit the base. And I even heard her offer him Captain Nazumi's treasure." Kujaku's eyes narrowed as murmurs spread among the gathered Marines. Asuka, however, didn't even flinch. First of all, none of that treasure belonged to Nazumi. It belonged to the people of the islands under his jurisdiction, the same people he bled dry for years. So there's no reason for any of you to get bent out of shape over it, because let's be honest, none of you were ever going to see a single belly of it, Asuka said, glaring at the Marine who had tried to shift the blame before turning back to Kujaku without missing a beat. "And second, every last bit of that money went to a good cause. I don't regret a thing." Kujaku's expression hardened. "Do you even hear yourself? You're saying you'd rather side with the outsiders who attacked this base than stand with your fellow Marines?" "My fellow Marines?" Asuka repeated, her voice flat and laced with contempt. Then she scoffed and shook her head slowly. "If you seriously think I want to claim allegiance with the likes of Nazumi or Draw, then you're more naive than I gave you credit for, Rear Admiral," she added with a humorless chuckle, clearly enjoying Kujaku's irritation. "And honestly, even though I don't know him that well, I can say without hesitation that Luffy is twice the man either of them ever were. He's honorable, he's principled, and, unlike some of the people in uniform, he actually gives a damn about doing what's right." "Wait, did you say Luffy?" Kobe, who had been lingering in the background, suddenly perked up and stepped forward, his eyes widening as he locked onto Asuka. "Are you sure it was him who attacked the base? Straw Hat, everything?" "Yes. That's right," Asuka replied, her voice tinged with mild confusion as she gave Kobe a puzzled look. She hadn't expected him to react so strongly to the name. "Not that damned boy again," Kujaku groaned, slamming her foot into the ground in frustration. The sound echoed across the courtyard. "It's like we're always 2 steps behind him, chasing his damn shadow." "So why did you give Luffy Nazumi's treasure?" Kobe asked, his curiosity piqued. "I doubt you were just feeling particularly charitable that day." Letting out a long sigh, Asuka explained the situation to the 2 rear admirals. How Nazumi had kidnapped Nami from Kokoyashi village 3 months ago and kept her locked in the dungeon with barely enough food to survive. She went on to explain that she had hired Luffy to return Nami safely to her village and had used Nazumi's stolen treasure as payment for the task. A heavy silence hung in the air as the weight of her words sank in. Kujaku's face twisted in an ugly scowl, her jaw clenched tightly. She couldn't help but curse Marine headquarters under her breath. This was the second corrupt Marine captain they'd uncovered in the East Blue in a matter of weeks. It was becoming glaringly clear that the region had been neglected, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the East Blue's reputation as a safe sea had caused the higher-ups to simply turn a blind eye. But Kujaku kept those thoughts to herself. Speaking them aloud in front of these junior Marines wouldn't help anyone. If anything, it would only shake their faith in Marine leadership. And that was the last thing she needed right now. "Whatever your reasons may be," Kujaku said, her voice hardening as she regained her composure, "it still doesn't excuse your actions. Your first D. You should have apprehended those criminals who attacked this base, not stood by while they looted it." She took a step forward, her gaze sharpening. "From now on, you're under my watch until we drop you off at Marineford. The higher-ups will decide your punishment. Now go pack your things. We're leaving soon." Asuka didn't respond. She gave Kujaku a long, unreadable look before turning and walking away without another word. "What a hassle." Kujaku sighed, running a hand through her hair in frustration. She dismissed the remaining Marines with a flick of her hand, signaling them to get back to their duties. Then, she turned toward Kobe, who stood quietly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I know what you're thinking," Kujaku said, her tone laced with understanding. "I guess our next destination is Kokoyashi village, to intercept that kid before he leaves, right?" Kobe's eyes sparked with determination. Of course, he replied, the fire in his gaze unmistakable. After chasing him this long, we finally have a real lead. With our warships, we'll be there in no time. When we catch up with him, we'll see for ourselves what kind of man this kid really is. The one who's been causing us so much trouble for so long. Meanwhile, the Going Merry was already approaching Kokoyashi village, the island's familiar silhouette taking shape on the horizon as Luffy stood on the deck, binoculars raised to his eyes. We should be reaching Kokoyashi village soon, he muttered to himself, lowering the binoculars and turning just in time to see Kaya walking towards him. Luffy, that girl, Nami, she's awake, Kaya said softly, her expression a mix of relief and lingering concern. She understandably panicked at first, but I told her everything. How and where you found her, how she ended up on our ship. I tried to be as gentle as I could, and she did calm down eventually, but now she's just sitting there, staring at the wall. Like she's somewhere else entirely. I see, Luffy replied, a frown settling on his face as he looked past Kaya, his mind clearly drifting toward the orange-haired girl, and her condition. Physically, she's nearly back to her normal strength, Kaya explained. My powers did everything they could, healed the injuries, stabilized her condition, but that's just the first step. What she needs now is real food, rest, and a bit of movement to rebuild her strength properly. Her voice grew quieter. As for her mental state, I honestly don't know. She has gone through a terrible experience, and something like that doesn't just fade. It leaves a scar. A deep one. One that could last for years, maybe even forever. Yeah, just as I figured. Physical wounds heal fast enough, but it's the ones in your heart that take the longest. And they hurt the most, Luffy muttered, clicking his tongue in frustration and shaking his head. Anyway, tell Zoro to keep watch for me. I'm going to check on her, he added, handing Kaya the binoculars before turning and making his way toward the girls' quarters. Upon entering the room, Luffy saw Nami sitting on the edge of the bed. She looked healthier than before, her color had returned, and the trembling in her limbs had subsided. But her eyes were dull, unfocused, fixed on the wall in front of her as if lost in a world far away. Hey, Nami, Luffy said gently as he approached her, keeping his voice calm and kind. I'm Luffy. It's nice to finally meet you. At the sound of his voice, Nami flinched slightly, her head turning toward him. She blinked a few times, recognition flickering in her eyes. Probably from the name Kaya had mentioned earlier. Hello, she said softly. Thank you for saving me. It's okay, Luffy replied with a small smile, his tone warm but steady. I just did what anyone decent should have done a long time ago, and honestly, if you ever meet Asuka, she's the one you should thank. If she hadn't told me about you, I wouldn't have known to come find you. Oh, okay, Nami murmured before lapsing back into silence, her gaze drifting once more to the wall. She looked like she was still trapped somewhere in her mind, caught between the present and the memory of whatever was tormenting her. Luffy felt the heavy silence in the room and searched for something to say, but quickly realized that his usual jokes or playful quips wouldn't be right for the moment. Looking at Nami, he could tell she wasn't in the right state of mind to appreciate either of them. So instead, he let out a soft sigh and spoke plainly. By the way, we'll be reaching Kokoyashi village soon. You'll be home again, with your family. Suddenly, Nami's eyes widened, and she stared at Luffy for a long moment before she burst out, home. Family. No, I can't go back. I can't go back, her voice cracked, and tears streamed down her face as she began sobbing uncontrollably. Please don't take me back there, please. Luffy was startled by her sudden outburst and panicked for a moment. He instinctively moved toward her to try to calm her down, but then froze, remembering that he didn't know the details of what she had endured in that hellish place. If he hugged her too suddenly, it might trigger painful memories and make her even worse. So instead of rushing in for a hug, Luffy crouched in front of her and gently took her hand in his, testing the waters. He gave it a soft squeeze. Nami, calm down, he said as gently as he could. But her sobs didn't stop. Okay, I won't force you to go back home, but can you tell me why? After hearing that she wasn't being forced to go back, Nami finally began to calm down. She looked at Luffy with tear-filled eyes. I can't go home. I just can't. That's what I'm asking you, Nami, Luffy said softly. Why do you think you can't go back? He paused, trying to understand. I thought you'd be happy to go back, to see your family again after all this time. So why? Nami stared at him for a long moment before tears began to well up again, streaming down her face. I can't go back. I failed them all, she cried, her voice breaking. I couldn't save my village from that damn Arlong. I failed Nijiko. I failed Belmere. Her sobs grew louder as their faces flashed in her mind. Overcome with emotion, she collapsed back onto the bed, burying her face in the pillow. Her sobs fading into quiet sniffling as she eventually drifted into a troubled sleep, her face still wet with tears. Luffy glanced one last time at Nami's sleeping form, letting out a quiet sigh. He gently released her hand and stood up, walking out of the room. As he exited, he immediately spotted Uda standing nearby, her arms folded across her chest. So, are we changing course? Uda asked, raising an eyebrow, because that girl didn't seem too eager about going home. Luffy shook his head, his expression firm. No, we're not changing course. We're still heading to Kokoyashi village to drop her off. What happened to her is tragic, but we can't put our journey on hold for it. Good, for a second there, I thought you were going soft on me, Uda teased, a smirk playing on her lips. In your dreams, Luffy rolled his eyes, his expression quickly turning fierce. That said, we're still going to take care of Arlong and his terrorizing of this village. And we're going after that bastard Nezumi too. He's going to pay for what he did to Nami. It's a matter of principle. And a promise I made to Asuka. You're such a softie, Uda rolled her eyes, shaking her head with a broad smile. Just then, Zoro walked up to them, holding the binoculars out to Luffy. There's some movement near the island. You might want to take a look. Movement near the island? Luffy raised an eyebrow, taking the binoculars from Zoro. He scanned the island, a grin slowly spreading across his face as he spotted the marine ship docked nearby. A wicked grin spread across Luffy's face as his eyes gleamed with a dangerous fire. No need to hunt down the rat. Looks like he's come straight to his own execution. To be continued. A mystical revenge, Raphael. System. On the small, battered port of Kokoyashi village, the stench of dread hung thick in the sweltering air. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, casting long, cruel shadows across the blood-stained wooden planks of the dock. There, Genzo and 4 other villagers knelt with their hands bound tightly behind their backs, their faces pressed against the rough, splintered boards. A line of fishmen loomed before them. Closest stood Hatchin, the octopus fishman, his 8 arms folded casually across his broad chest, wide mouth twitching with a cheerfulness far too out of place for the grim scene. The others prowled behind him like sharks circling prey, their weapons already drawn and gleaming, hungry for blood. Well, sneered a green-scaled fish man with jagged fins running down his spine. If it ain't the brave sheriff of Kokoyashi. He let out a mocking laugh and rested his blade against the neck of the woman kneeling beside Genzo. She whimpered, trembling, but Genzo didn't flinch. His eyes, once fierce and defiant, were now dim and lifeless, staring vacantly toward the horizon. Another fishman struck him in the shoulder with the blunt end of his weapon, making him jerk forward. Oi! Don't ignore us, you pathetic worm. Weren't you the one screamin' about freedom and resistance just last week? He leaned closer, voice dripping with cruelty. What happened, huh? Gonna fight for your village? Gonna stand up to Captain Arlong? His laugh was long and harsh, echoing across the dock. Where's all that fire now? I'll tell you where it went, growled the largest of them, a hulking brute with a twisted scar pulling at one corner of his mouth. It got snuffed out. Just like your precious Nami. Just like every other fool who thought humans could defy us. Humans, another fishman spat, curling his lip in disgust. Soft bones. Soft hearts. Soft brains. You're not built to rule. You're built to serve, and if you're lucky, to survive, but not today. Genzo said nothing. His lips stayed shut, but the pain in his eyes deepened, an ache sharper than any blade. At the mention of Nami, the final ember of hope flickered and died behind his gaze, leaving behind only silence and despair. Look at him, Hatchin chuckled, scratching behind one of his ears. He already looks like a dead fish. Maybe we don't even need to finish him off. Not yet, the green-scaled fish man replied, stepping forward. He crouched in front of Genzo until they were eye to eye. his jagged teeth gleaming in the sunlight. I want him to hear this first. I want it to stick. He grinned, a twisted, cruel smile. Nami. That wild little redhead, always clinging to your leg, always so full of hope. Thought she could scrape together 100 million berries and buy your freedom from Arlong. He scoffed. How pathetic. Cruel laughter echoed from the surrounding fishmen as Genzo lowered his head, silent tears slipping down his weathered cheeks. But you know what's even better? The green-scaled one sneered, leaning in closer. I bet that Marine's already turned her into a broken little toy by now. That'll teach her what happens when you even think about leaving Arlong's crew. He stood slowly, face hardening. But that doesn't matter to you, does it? He said coldly, raising his sword high. You won't be around to see her come back. The blade arced toward Genzo but never reached him. A thunderous bang split the air. A golden laser tore clean through the fishman's skull, leaving a neat, smoking hole. He collapsed without a sound while the rest of the fishmen stared in horror at their fallen comrade, frozen in disbelief. For a moment, silence reigned until 3 more sharp cracks rang out in rapid succession. Each shot found its mark. One by one, the other fishmen dropped lifeless to the dock, their weapons clattering uselessly beside them. Meanwhile, on the Going Merry, which was slowly approaching the dock, Uta stood crouching on the figurehead of the lamb, holding a tour de force in her hand while aiming down sight. 4 down, 1 to go, Uta said as she brought the translucent holographic sight to her purple eye and aimed at the terrified 8-armed fisherman standing frozen in his place. However, just as Uta began to steady her finger on the trigger, a hand gently landed on her shoulder. Wait a minute, Luffy said, his voice calm but firm. Let me handle this. Without waiting for a response, he leapt off the Going Merry just as it drifted to a halt at the dock. He landed with ease and began walking slowly toward Hatchin, who stumbled back in fear and fell onto his rear. Pete, please don't hurt me, Hatchin cried, tears already spilling down his cheeks. I surrender, I give up. Luffy's eyes were cold and unreadable as a shimmering crystal blade materialized in his hand. You've got a lot of nerve saying that after everything you've done to this village and its people, he said. But before I pass judgment, tell me something. Do you know an old man named Rayleigh? Hatchin blinked rapidly, confusion flashing briefly across his tear-streaked face before he remembered an old form Sabati. Yes, I know Rayleigh, please, I know him. In that case, I won't kill you, Luffy said, and for a moment, hope returned to Hatchin's eyes, only to vanish in the next second as he screamed in pain. Luffy had slashed with his sword, severing 2 of Hatchin's 8 arms. But I can't let you walk away unscathed, not after everything you've done to these people. He rested the sword's edge against Hatchin's neck. Now you have 2 options. You can flee, leave this place, and never show your face in the East Blue again. Or you can stay, and die like the rest of that trash. No, I'll leave, I'll go. Just don't kill me, Hatchin sobbed, pressing his remaining hands against his wounds. Luffy gave a nod and signaled Kaya, who floated over and used her power to close the gaping wounds, sealing the flesh and stopping the bleeding on Hatchin's shoulders where his arms had once been. Now go, Luffy said, his tone leaving no room for argument, and remember, the only reason you're still breathing is because of your connection to Rayleigh. Don't make me regret it. Hatchin nodded frantically, too afraid to speak, and scrambled toward one of the rowboats tied at the end of the dock. With trembling arms, he pushed off, casting one final glance back at the island, debating whether he should warn Arlong. But fear and the overwhelming instinct to survive made the choice for him. The memory of Luffy's blade and the icy look in his eyes crushed the thought before it could fully form, and without another word, he turned and rowed away from Kokoyashi village. Meanwhile, back at the port, Luffy let out a quiet sigh as Hatchin's rowboat faded into the horizon, vanishing into the endless blue. Just then, he sensed a presence behind him. Turning, he saw Uta standing with her arms crossed, a deep frown etched across her face. Why did you spare that octopus fishman? She asked sharply, as the rest of the crew began untying the villagers and helping them to their feet. What makes him different from the rest of those pieces of a shit? She gestured pointedly at the lifeless corpses of the 4 fishmen sprawled across the dock. Luffy shrugged. Nothing that I can think of, he said simply. Uta's eyes narrowed, but he didn't offer her much else. Then why? she pressed, clearly irritated by his vague response. Luffy smirked at her, deliberately testing her patience. "Just think of it as me investing in our future," he said in a cryptic tone, before walking past her. Uda stood still, lips pressed into a thin line of frustration, the unanswered question still burning in her mind. Luffy then approached the freed villagers, who stood around in stunned silence, still shell-shocked by what they had just witnessed. A faint awe flickered in their eyes as they looked from the bodies of the fallen fish men to the people who had defeated them, a feat they had never thought possible for any human. But one different than before. Genzo stood off to the side, arms limp at his sides, his gaze locked on the horizon. The same gray, lifeless stare he'd worn before the bloodshed had never left his face. "Well, old man, you look pretty down for someone who just got saved from execution," Luffy said, stopping in front of him. Genzo didn't look at him. His voice came low and hollow. "What is there to be happy about?" A long silence stretched between them as the wind rustled gently through the ruined village. "I'm a failure," Genzo continued, his eyes never leaving the sea. "I couldn't keep a promise to a dead friend. I couldn't protect the one girl in this whole godforsaken village who still had hope." His voice wavered as his fists clenched, trembling at his sides. "Her mother trusted me. And I let her daughter walk into hell alone." He drew a shaky breath, shoulders heavy with regret. "Tell me, what's the point of someone like me still being alive?" "Well, old man, I can't exactly tell you what you should or shouldn't do with your life," Luffy said, resting a hand on Genzo's shoulder. "But I know someone who'd be pretty upset if you threw it away like this." He tilted his head toward the Going Merry, where an orange-haired girl stood silently on the deck, eyes locked on Genzo. A single tear slid down her cheek, tracing a line across her freckled face. Nami didn't speak. She didn't need to. The pain, the relief, and the guilt were all there, written in the way her fingers gripped the railing. She had always known, deep down, that Genzo cared about her and Nejico. It had been obvious, even to someone who didn't want to see it. He was the quiet sort of guardian, always there in the background, helping where he could, scolding when he had to, shielding them from the world in the only way he knew how. But she had never imagined he cared this deeply, never expected that her absence could leave him so hollow, so broken, so willing to give up. It warmed her heart in a way she wasn't prepared for, knowing that someone beyond her sister had loved her enough to grieve like this. And at the same time, it made her heart ache even more. She hadn't meant to make him or anyone worry about her. Genzo stared at Nami as though seeing a ghost. His eyes widened, breath caught in his throat. "Nami." He whispered, the name barely audible, as if he didn't quite believe he was saying it, or that she was really standing there. From the Going Merry, Nami descended slowly, each step hesitant. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, as if holding herself together. She looked torn between the urge to run to Genzo and the overwhelming weight pressing down on her. The single tear that had slipped down her cheek earlier was just the beginning. More followed, glimmering in the sunlight as they traced quiet paths down her face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice fragile, cracking under the emotion she could no longer contain. "I'm so sorry I made you worry." Genzo didn't move. He stood there as if rooted to the earth, as though the grief and guilt of the past days had chained him in place. His body remained frozen, but his eyes were locked on her, wide with disbelief. You're alive," he murmured, stepping forward, one shaky foot after the other. "You're really here. I thought I lost you. I thought you were gone, and that it was my fault. That I hadn't done enough to stop it. I was supposed to protect you." "You did," Nami said softly, closing the distance between them. "You and Nejico. You gave me the strength to survive. To keep going when everything felt hopeless. That's why I didn't give up. Even when I wanted to." Genzo's lip trembled as he looked at her, overwhelmed by emotion. I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, barely managing to hold himself together. His voice cracked, but he pressed on, shaking his head. "But this isn't about me. Not now. There's someone else who needs to see that you're safe with her own eyes." With that, Genzo took her hand and began leading her into the village, while the rest of the crew followed in silence, having first kicked the fishermen's corpses into the sea. In a small house nestled near the hill, a young woman sat alone in silence. Her light blue hair fell messily over her shoulders, and her tanned skin glowed faintly beneath the inked patterns that marked her right arm and chest. Every curtain in the house had been pulled tight, shutting out even the faintest trace of daylight. The room was steeped in shadow, save for the dim, flickering light of a half-melted candle on the table. She was hunched over, elbows resting on the worn wood of the dining table, her fingers clenched tightly around a nearly empty bottle. Her breathing was uneven, shallow, and growing worse with each bitter sip. The alcohol trembled in her grip with every ragged inhale as her eyes remained fixed on a single, small photograph lying before her. An old picture of her younger sister, smiling brightly, full of life. She lifted the bottle again, lips parting as if to drink, but stopped halfway. Her hand shook too much. A few drops spilled onto the table, but she didn't notice. Or maybe she didn't care. Nijiko didn't speak. She hadn't spoken in hours. Maybe days or even months. She just sat there, drowning not only in liquor but in guilt, fear, and the unbearable weight of not knowing the fate of her dear little sister. Just then, a knock echoed from the front door. Nijiko didn't respond. She had heard knocks like this dozens of times over the past few months, and she had learned to ignore them. It was always the same, someone from the village bringing kind words she didn't ask for, gently telling her to hold on, to keep hoping, to endure. But what they really brought was pity. And pity was the last thing she wanted. No. The only thing she wanted was her sister back. And just the thought of Nami was enough to make her chest ache and her eyes blur with fresh, bitter tears. But whoever was at the door seemed oblivious to her grief. The knocking turned into pounding, relentless and sharp, snapping what little composure she had left. Finally, with a strangled cry of frustration, Nijiko slammed both hands down on the table, the sound echoing through the quiet house. The force sent the nearly empty bottle skittering and the chair behind her toppling to the floor with a harsh crash. She stood there for a second, trembling with fury and pain, then took a sharp, shaky breath through clenched teeth before storming into the kitchen and grabbing a 10-inch kitchen knife from the counter as a cold, bloodthirsty gleam lit up her eyes. She had made up her mind that if it was someone from the village, she would tear into them with words and make it crystal clear that she didn't need comfort. And if it was one of Arlong's men, she would strike first, no matter the consequences. With her mind made up, she moved toward the door with steady steps, the knife hidden behind her back, fully prepared to take at least one fishman down with her. Nijiko stood just inches from the door, her chest rising and falling with shallow, rapid breaths. The knife trembled in her grip behind her back, fingers clamped so tightly around the handle her knuckles had gone white. Her nostrils flared with every ragged inhale, the air hot in her lungs. Her other hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating. "Just get it over with," she muttered under her breath, her voice hoarse, raw from silence and swallowed grief. Then, with a sharp inhale, she yanked the door open. And everything stopped. There, silhouetted by the fading afternoon light, stood a girl with messy orange hair, thinner than she remembered, but unmistakably her sister. "Nami?" Nijiko breathed, the word catching in her throat like a prayer she didn't dare believe. The knife slipped from her fingers and clattered uselessly to the wooden floor. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Nami's lips parted, trembling, her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her voice a soft, fragile whisper. "Hey. Sis. I'm home." Nijiko took a staggering step back, her hands as her eyes brimmed with tears. No, this can't be. You." Her voice cracked under the weight of disbelief, the dam she had spent months building crumbling all at once. And then Nami ran to her. Nijiko moved instinctively, catching her before she could fall. They crashed into each other in the doorway, arms wrapping around one another like lifelines tossed into a storm. Nami buried her face into her sister's shoulder, her small frame trembling with each broken sob. Nijiko held her tight, one hand tangled in her messy hair, the other gripping her back with such force it was as if she feared letting go would make her disappear again. "You're alive," Nijiko gasped, voice shaking. "You're alive, you're alive, you're alive. I didn't think I'd ever see you again," Nami choked out between sobs. "I thought I was going to die in that place. I thought I'd never make it back. I thought you were already gone," Nijiko sobbed, her whole body shaking as she clung to her sister. "Every day, I waited. Every night, I dreamed that this door would open and you'd be standing there. And every single time, it was someone else. Or it was no one at all." I'm sorry, Nami whispered, the words muffled against Nejiko's shoulder. I'm sorry I made you worry, I didn't mean to. Don't you ever say that, Nejiko whispered fiercely, pulling back just enough to cup Nami's face in her trembling hands. Their foreheads pressed together, tears streaming down both of their cheeks. You came home. That's all that matters, nothing else, nothing else. For a long moment, they just held each other there in the doorway before pulling apart. By the way, Nami, Nejiko said, glancing past her sister toward the group standing a few feet from the porch, who are these people? Nami turned and smiled faintly. Oh. That. She rubbed the back of her neck, then began to explain how Luffy had rescued her from the 16th Marine Branch, how he and the rest of his crew had helped her recover afterward, and how they'd brought her home, safe and whole. When she finished, Nejiko turned to the Straw Hats. Her expression softened, and she stepped forward slowly. Then, without a word, she bowed her head low. Thank you, she said quietly, voice filled with as much gratitude as she could gather. Thank you for saving my sister, for bringing her home. Luffy blinked, then scrunched his nose and took a step back. That's nice and all, he said, waving a hand in front of his face. But could you maybe back up a little? You seriously reek of booze. I'm afraid I'll get drunk just breathing the same air as you. Nejiko froze, her eyes widening in alarm as the realization crashed down on her. In all the emotion, she'd completely forgotten the stench of alcohol that clung to her skin and clothes, the same stench that had surrounded her for months. Her cheeks flushed a deep red as shame curled in her gut. Oh God. She muttered under her breath, suddenly mortified. Right. Yeah. Everyone, just give me a moment. I need to, clean myself up a bit. She turned on her heel and bolted back inside the house. But a few seconds later, she re-emerged, wincing and pressing a hand to her temple. Genzo, she called out, her voice slightly strained. Can you grab me something for a hangover? My head's killing me. I think Nami's return sobered me up too fast, and now I remember just how much I drank. Genzo, who'd been standing off to the side quietly until now, lit up with a new sense of energy. I'm on it, he shouted, already jogging down the path toward the village. His footsteps were lighter, almost eager, as if he'd shed years of exhaustion in the span of a few minutes. Nami's return had brought him back to life too. Nami, watching the two of them with a soft smile, shook her head gently. Still the same as ever, she murmured fondly, then stepped inside the house. The warmth faded from her expression almost instantly. The moment she crossed the threshold, a wave of sour air hit her like a punch to the gut. Stale booze, musty fabric, and the heavy dampness of long-closed windows. She coughed, recoiling slightly. Now I get what Luffy meant, she muttered, squinting as she crinkled her nose. I think I'm getting drunk just standing here. Her eyes swept over the living room, and what she saw made her stomach tighten. Empty bottles lay scattered across the floor and counters. The curtains were still drawn, the light inside dim and yellowed. Dust clung to every surface. There was a weight in the air that hadn't lifted in months. She stood there for a long moment, just staring, until finally, with a tired sigh, she crossed the room and threw the curtains open, letting in the afternoon sun light spilled across the floorboards, catching on the glass and highlighting the mess in full detail. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She rolled up her sleeves. Guess I'll get this place looking like a home again, she said softly, and got to work while Luffy and the others helped in whatever way they could. Later that night, Nami stood alone on the grassy hill overlooking the sea, her arms wrapped loosely around herself as the full moon cast its silver glow across the gently rolling waves. Her expression was calm, serene, almost peaceful, but there was a quiet weight behind her eyes as the cool breeze brushed past her. Behind her, nestled in the earth, stood the grave of her mother, marked by a simple headstone and surrounded by wildflowers that had grown tall in the summer air. It was a familiar place, one that had always brought her comfort in the worst of times, the place she had always come to when she needed clarity, a place that brought her peace. And it was this very hill she missed most during those long, hopeless days locked in that dungeon. Then she turned around, deciding to head back when she spotted Luffy returning from somewhere. Luffy noticed her as well and walked towards her. Nami, what are you doing out here this late? He asked as he came to stand beside her, glancing briefly at the grave behind her before turning his gaze back to her. Nami looked down and rubbed her forearm absently. Just thinking about stuff. Needed some air, you know, she said quietly. What about you? She asked after a pause. Where were you coming from? Just checking if that bastard Nezumi was still snooping around, Luffy replied, and caught the way Nami flinched at the name but chose not to comment on it. He's still here, staying on the island tonight. Oh, Nami murmured, barely louder than the breeze. Her arms wrapped a little tighter around herself, as if bracing against something colder than the wind. I see. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of distant waves and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. So, do you want to get revenge on Nezumi? For everything he did to you? Nami blinked, caught off guard by the question. Revenge? Me? She repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. It caught in her throat. In that instant, a flood of memories surged forward. Those long, hellish days in the dungeon, the humiliation, the fear, the countless times Nezumi's voice had slithered into her ears like poison, laced with cruelty and contempt. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as anger flared to life within her. But then she looked down at herself. At her too thin arms, the bruises still fading from her skin, the toll of months spent in captivity etched into her body, and that flickering fire began to dim. I don't think I can, she said in a small voice. Not like this. But what if you could? Luffy asked, turning his head towards her. What if I gave you the chance to get your revenge? Would you take it? Yes. Nami said instantly, her voice trembling with unconcealed fury and desperation. If I could, I'd end that bastard Marine captain's life with my own hands. I want to be there when he takes his last breath. Looking into the eyes of the girl he thought he could break, and turn into his plaything, I want that to be the last thing he sees. That's the spirit, then pulled something out of nowhere. A devil fruit, its surface an unnatural shade of blue, covered in swirling patterns. What is that? Nami asked, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. This is a devil fruit that'll help you get your revenge, Luffy said, holding it out toward her, and as for the powers it offers. The next morning, Marine Captain Nezumi strolled along a narrow dirt road that wound through the quiet outskirts of the village, flanked by two of his subordinates. But his mind wasn't on the path ahead. It was still back at the 16th branch base, fixated on a certain prisoner locked away in the dungeon. A slow, revolting grin crept across his face as he licked his lips, lost in the haze of his perverse imagination. Each twisted fantasy played through his mind like a favorite melody, growing more depraved with every repetition. But then, his smile faltered as another face intruded on his thoughts, Asuka. That damn new recruit. She had already made it perfectly clear that she wouldn't let him do as he pleased, especially not with that prisoner. And worse still, she was stronger than him. He knew he couldn't lay a finger on her without losing a tooth or two in the process. Still, he wasn't without options. As base captain, he held enough authority to fabricate charges, and he intended to use it. All he needed was the right excuse, something to have her removed, reassigned, or even court-martialed. Whatever it took to get her out of the picture. Once she was gone, there'd be no one left to stop him from doing whatever he wanted with the girl in the dungeon. That vile grin slithered back across his face as he let out a low, wheezing giggle like a rat choking on its own filth. The two Marines trailing behind him exchanged a quick, uneasy glance, but neither said a word. They both knew exactly what their captain was likely thinking about, but they also knew there was nothing they could do to stop it. They were just low-ranking soldiers, without the authority or influence to challenge, let alone restrict, a superior officer's decisions. But there was another truth, one far more damning. A truth they, and every other Marine under Nezumi's command, were reluctant to admit even to themselves. Deep down, they simply didn't care enough. Not about the girl rotting in the dungeon. Not about the people of the Konami Islands. Not enough to speak up, and certainly not enough to risk their positions and the steady paycheck they received each month for doing next to nothing. Especially when compared to some of their Marine Academy classmates, who were out risking their lives in far more dangerous parts of the sea for the same or sometimes even less compensation. So, like always, they kept their heads down and marched on in silence, like loyal dogs trailing behind a rotten master. Oi, Nezumi, a loud, deep voice suddenly rang out from behind. The group froze and turned, their bodies instinctively tensing as they spotted a large, muscular saw shark fish man striding toward them. His skin was a light blue, his grin wide and filled with jagged teeth. Arlong, Nezumi muttered, his voice faltering as he instinctively straightened his back, trying and failing to hide the fear creeping into his tone in front of his men. "It's a good thing I found you here," Arlong said with a chuckle, clapping a massive hand onto Nezumi's shoulder. The force of the gesture made the Marine captain flinch. Otherwise, I'd have been really irritated. "Why yeah, lucky for you," Nezumi replied through gritted teeth, his voice strained. "So, what do you want from me?" Nezumi, Arlong's grin widened, taking on a sharper, more menacing edge. "Even if you were human, I thought you were better than this." Nezumi immediately picked up on the unspoken message. Arlong wanted to speak in private. He turned to his subordinates without hesitation. "Leave, now." They didn't need to be told twice. Without a word, both Marines turned and walked away briskly, neither daring to look back. "Come with me," Arlong said, veering off the dirt path and into the dense forest. Nezumi hesitated for a brief moment, then followed a few steps behind. "You see," Arlong began as they walked beneath the thick canopy, "some of my people have been hearing rumors that the villagers are gathering money to buy that girl, Nami, back." He let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "They actually believe that handing over a few million berries to you will get her released." Nezumi snorted. "They really are delusional fools," he sneered, the corners of his mouth curling up in contempt. "So what do you suggest we do?" "There's nothing to plan," Arlong replied coolly, coming to a stop once they were deep within the trees. He turned to face Nezumi, and the grin on his face stretched wider, twisting into something wild, cold, and cruel. Nezumi's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" he asked warily, a sliver of unease creeping into his voice at the sudden shift in Arlong's tone. "I mean," Arlong growled, his voice low and dangerous, "that after today, they won't need to pay a single berry." Not to Arlong. His eyes narrowed, sharp as blades. "And certainly not to a filthy rat like you." Before Nezumi could process the words, Arlong's massive arm lashed out. The blow hit with crushing force, sending the Marine captain hurtling through the air like a rag doll. He slammed into a tree with a sickening thud, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs and leaving him sprawled in the dirt, gasping. "Arlong, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Nezumi shouted, gritting his teeth against the pain as he clutched his side. "Have you forgotten that your entire rule depends on the two of us working together? Ha! Look at you, squirming on the ground like the filthy rat you are." Arlong barked out a laugh, striding toward him with heavy, deliberate steps. "And let me tell you something." He loomed over the wounded captain, eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "I don't know if Arlong gives a damn whether you live or die." His grin stretched wider, teeth glinting in the dappled forest light, "but I certainly don't." Suddenly, strange ripples shimmered across his skin, like the surface of disturbed water, and Nezumi's eyes widened in shock as the towering fish man's height began to shrink. Muscles drew inward. The long, saw-like nose retracted into the face. His broad shoulders narrowed, and his massive hands became delicate and familiar. In the blink of an eye, standing where Arlong had been was Nami, the very girl who was supposed to be locked away in the 16th branch dungeon. But now she stood tall, her body lean yet visibly stronger, far more muscular than someone who had been starved for 3 months should have been. "Captain Nezumi of the 16th branch," Nami said coldly, her voice steady with fury, "today, you'll feel everything you did to me. Today, you'll feel the helplessness you forced on me, the despair you made my family endure." Ripples shimmered across her hand as her nails extended into razor-sharp claws. "Today, you'll feel pain. To be continued. A Mystical Revenge, Part 2. Raphael. Raphael, System. Meanwhile, at Arlong Park, a heavy tension hung in the air while Arlong the Saw lounged on his stone throne at the center of the courtyard, and around him stood his loyal crew, their gills flaring with agitation and anticipation. In front of him stood Karubi, a tall and powerfully built ray fish man clad in a traditional martial artist's gi. His brow was furrowed, his fists clenched at his sides as he delivered his report. "Arlong," he said darkly, "I searched the entire dock, but there's no sign of Hatchin or the others, and no trace of anyone who was supposed to be executed there." "That damned village," snarled Chu, a thick-lipped smelt whiting fishman. His fists trembled with rage. and his eyes burned with a cold, murderous gleam. Those filthy human maggots must have done something to them. I'm with him, Karubi growled. Those worthless humans probably used some dirty trick. A low, humorless chuckle rumbled from Arlong's throat. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, sharp teeth glinting as he grinned. I see. Then his voice turned cold and commanding. In that case, head to that miserable village. See if that useless excuse for a sheriff is still breathing. If he is, drag him back here. Alive. Arlong's grin widened into something savage and cruel. It's time we reminded those filthy humans who they belong to. The moment the words left his mouth, Arlong Park exploded into a frenzy of bloodthirsty cheers, roaring their captain's name with bloodthirsty excitement. Meanwhile, back at Nami's house, Luffy and the crew had just finished the breakfast Nijiko had prepared, and now they were lounging around the table, chatting casually. Zoro, leaning back with his arms crossed, glanced up and noticed Reiju staring at him. He frowned. Oi, why are you looking at me like that? Reiju blinked, as if pulled from her thoughts. Oh, it's nothing. I was just thinking, she said, and after a moment added, Hey, Zoro. Do you think you could teach me how to use a sword? Zoro blinked, caught off guard. Huh? Where the hell did that come from? Well, after everything that happened at Baratie, I started thinking about how I can get stronger. Everyone here has their own way of training, their own style. But me? I don't really have anything like that. So I figured. Maybe I should try learning swordsmanship, Reiju explained. Zoro's eye twitched. What kind of half-baked logic is that? He snapped. And besides, I don't have time to waste training some complete rookie. Actually, I don't think it's a bad idea, Luffy said, casually resting his chin on his palm. In fact, I already have a path in mind that might suit your growth. But before we get into that, tell me, Reiju, how much do you know about poisons? Poisons? Reiju tilted her head slightly, caught off guard by the question. Well, when I was a kid, I worked briefly as my father's assistant, she said, her voice growing noticeably colder at the mention of him. One of his researcher friends taught me quite a bit about poisons during that time. He was, honestly, kind of a creep. Always laughing like a maniac, definitely not the kind of guy you'd want around children. But as messed up as he was, I'll admit, he was a damn good teacher. That's perfect, Luffy nodded thoughtfully. After a beat, he turned to Zoro. Zoro, once we set sail again, I want you to start teaching Reiju the basics of swordsmanship. Zoro looked like he'd just bitten into a sour lemon. Luffy, what the hell? I'm already training all of you in haki and total concentration breathing, aren't I? Luffy cut in, raising a brow. Think of this as another part of the crew's growth. And besides, teaching someone else is one of the best ways to sharpen your own fundamentals. Zoro let out a long, resigned sigh. Fine. But I'm not teaching her any of my actual techniques. With her current build and strength, they wouldn't suit her anyway. I know. That's not a problem, Luffy replied confidently. I'll design a whole new set of techniques specifically for her. Zoro gave him a skeptical look. You? Wow. I could feel your doubt in that one word, Luffy chuckled, then glanced at Reiju. As for you, start reviewing everything you know about poisons, and begin mastering total concentration breathing as soon as possible. The techniques I'm creating for you are going to be built around those. Just as the crew was about to continue their conversation, they were suddenly interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing through the house. Nijiko, who had been rushing from room to room with visible panic on her face, finally appeared in the doorway, breathless and clearly distressed. Unable to contain her worry any longer, she came to a stop in front of the group, who were still laughing and joking around the table, seemingly unaware of her growing anxiety. Sorry to interrupt, Nijiko said, her voice tight with worry, but has anyone seen Nami? I have no idea where that idiot ran off to this early, especially when her body hasn't even fully recovered yet. Don't worry, she's probably around here somewhere, Reiju said, waving a hand dismissively as she twirled a strand of her hair between her fingers. No, that's the problem, Nijiko snapped, her pacing growing more frantic. I've looked everywhere, her room, the beach, even Belmare's grave, but I still couldn't find her anywhere. Calm down, Nijiko, Uda said gently, rising from her seat with a reassuring smile. Nami's an adult. And more importantly, she's home now. She's not going to get lost in her own backyard. I'm not worried about her getting lost. Nijiko shot back, her voice shaking slightly. I'm worried that if any of Arlong's men catch even a glimpse of her walking around the village, they'll go straight to him. And if that happens, your whole rescue mission could be for nothing, and… She stopped pacing, clutching her arms tightly around herself as her voice dropped to a whisper. I can't lose my sister again. The air in the room turned heavy, the light-hearted mood vanishing in an instant. All right, we'll help you find Nami, Uda said, standing up and glancing at the rest of the crew. Come on, get off your butts, guys. We've got a girl to track down, she said as the rest of the crew began rising from their seats. I'm really sorry for causing you all so much trouble, Nijiko said softly, bowing her head. You already saved Nami from that bastard Marine, and now I'm dragging you into this again. I'm really sorry for dragging you into this again, Nijiko murmured, lowering her head. You already saved Nami from that bastard Marine, and now I'm asking for even more. First of all, Nijiko, stop moping, Luffy said, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed behind his head. We didn't go through all that trouble to rescue Nami just to let her drop dead the moment she got home. He let that hang in the air for a moment, then added casually, and besides, there's no need to search for her. I already know exactly where she is. Huh? Where? Nijiko asked urgently, eyes wide with alarm. Nami went to take her revenge on that bastard Nezumi, Luffy replied, his tone maddeningly calm. You know, the corrupt Marine captain who locked her up. She's probably halfway through teaching him a lesson by now. What? Nijiko's face twisted in shock. You let her go alone? Are you insane? Why didn't you say anything earlier? She could be in serious danger, she's not even fully healed, and Nezumi's still a Marine officer. I had to go and stop her before. Before she could spiral any further, Luffy stood up, walked over, and placed his hands on her shoulders, giving her a light shake. Nijiko. Calm the fuck down, he said firmly, cutting through her panic. Nami's not in danger. I gave her exactly what she needed to get her revenge on that rat. You gave her something from your devil fruit, didn't you? Uda asked, narrowing her eyes at Luffy, already piecing it together replied with a grin, casually flashing her a thumbs up. And besides, none of you even realized our little angel isn't here. The crew collectively blinked, their expressions shifting from confusion to surprise, as they glanced around, only to realize that Kaya was, indeed, missing. TCH. Just as I thought, Luffy said, shaking his head with an exaggerated sigh. Poor Kaya. Forgotten by her own friends. How shameful. That's gotta be because of that annoying cloak you gave her, Reiju huffed, crossing her arms with a frown. It's like she vanishes into thin air. Yup. That's kind of the point, Luffy said, unfazed. It helps her blend into the background and go unnoticed. That's why I sent her to quietly tail Nami. She's keeping her distance, but she'll step in if anything goes wrong. So relax, Nami's not alone. Nijiko began, her voice tight with lingering concern, but before she could finish her sentence, a sudden eruption of shouting and chaos echoed from the direction of the village. What now? Nijiko muttered, her brow furrowing as she turned toward the window. Then her eyes widened, a cold chill creeping into her voice. No. It has to be Arlong. Or his men. They're causing trouble for the villagers again. Well, Luffy said, stretching his arms casually as he made his way to the door. Sounds like it's time for us to move out. But just as he reached for the handle, Nijiko rushed forward and grabbed his arm, stopping him in his tracks. Luffy, please, she said, her voice trembling with desperation. I know you're strong, but these are fishmen. You don't understand what they're capable of. We humans. We can't compete with their strength. Fighting them is suicide. Her grip tightened. Why don't you just take Nami and leave this village behind? If you go now, you can get her out of this cursed place. Somewhere far away where Arlong can never reach her. At least she'd be safe. Nijiko. I get where you're coming from, I really do. You're scared. You've lived under Arlong's shadow for so long, it's hard to imagine anything stronger than him. But there's nothing to worry about, Luffy reassured her with a smile. Your fear emerges from your limited worldview in which Arlong is the strongest person you know, but what you don't know is that Arlong isn't even close to the strongest person in the East Blue. There are pirates, marines, and monsters out there who make him look like a joke. He's nothing more than a cockroach, one that's crawled into a dark little corner of the sea, thriving by stomping on those who can't fight back. But unfortunately for Arlong, a feral smile spread across his face. I'm not weak, and I hate bullies. With that, Luffy stepped out of the house, and one by one, the rest of the crew followed, each wearing a confident grin across their faces. Ijiko stood frozen for a moment, still reeling from Luffy's words. But then, silently, she found herself moving too, following behind the straw hat-wearing boy. As Luffy and the crew entered the village, they were met with a disturbing sight. In the middle of the town square, Karubi stood towering over Genzo, his fists clenched and his face twisted in fury. The old sheriff was on his knees, clutching his side and breathing heavily. "Old man, I'm asking you for the last time, where are Hatchin and the others?" Karubi barked, his voice thunderous. "What did you do to our fishman brothers?" Without waiting for an answer, he drove a brutal kick into Genzo's ribs. The sheriff gasped, the impact knocking the wind out of him, but he still managed to lift his head defiantly. "Go to hell," Genzo spat, his teeth gritted through the pain. "I don't care what you do to me. I'm not telling you a damn thing, you monster." Karubi's expression darkened with fury, but then his lips slowly twisted into a cruel smile. "Oh, I see. So you don't care about your own life. But what about others?" he murmured, leaning in, his voice dripping with venom. Genzo's eyes widened as a cold dread crept over him. "How about I pay a visit to Nami's sister?" Karubi continued. "I bet we could make a tidy profit selling her off. I hear human women fetch a fine price." "Don't you dare lay a hand on Nijiko," Genzo roared, his voice raw with fury. "Haven't you already tormented those girls enough? What more could you possibly want?" Karubi threw his head back and let out a bitter, mocking laugh. "You call this torment?" he sneered. "This is justice. For centuries, your kind enslaved, hunted, and butchered mine. And now, the tables turn just a little, and you cry like weak, pathetic worms." His eyes glowed with contempt as he leaned down, staring Genzo straight in the eye. "As for Nijiko, she, you, and this entire village belong to us now. We can do whatever we please with any of you. And what, exactly, is a feeble old man like you going to do about it?" "I don't know about that, feeble old man," Luffy cut in, stepping forward with a wide grin as he casually pointed to himself with his thumb. "But this strong young man's gonna do a lot to you if you threaten our friends again." Karubi's head snapped toward the voice, his brow furrowing as he took in the group of people with unfamiliar faces standing behind Genzo. Just by their clothes, and the complete lack of fear in their eyes, he could tell they weren't from around here. "Who the hell are you humans?" he growled, eyes narrowing. "And how did you even get here?" "We came by a ship, dumbass," Kuina scoffed, arms crossed as she met his glare with one of her own. "What other ride do you think we took?" Karubi bristled, baring his sharp teeth. "Watch your mouth, human," he barked, voice rising with fury. "Don't forget you're standing in front of a superior species." "Superior species, huh?" Kuina said with a sharp, bloodthirsty smile. "Why don't we put that to the test?" In the blink of an eye, she lunged forward, thrusting the green-tipped blade of her skyward-spined polearm straight toward Karubi's chest. Too fast, Karubi's eyes widened in shock. He barely had time to register her movement before the weapon slammed into him, striking squarely in the center of his chest with explosive force. The impact hurled him backward. His massive body slammed into the dirt, skidding across the ground and carving a deep trail through soil and dust before grinding to a halt. As he tried to stand, a wave of burning agony tore through his torso. He gasped, clutching at his chest, only to feel warm, wet blood pulsing between his fingers. He looked down and froze upon seeing a deep, gaping stab wound in the center of his chest, from which blood flowed freely in thick, crimson streams. "She actually hurt him," Genzo muttered in disbelief, eyes wide as he stared at the young girl who stood so calmly, her weapon still gleaming with fresh blood. She didn't look any older than Nami or Nijiko, yet she had just done what none of them had ever managed. And he wasn't alone in his shock. From behind windows and doorways, villagers who had been watching in fear now peeked out, eyes wide with awe and disbelief. The fishmen had ruled over them for years, untouchable, unbeatable, monsters. But now, One of them had been wounded by a human girl. "You," Karubi roared, his voice shaking with fury as he glared at Kuina, eyes bloodshot and burning with hatred. "How dare a filthy human like you wound me?" "You want a repeat performance, chump," Kuina said, smirking coldly as she spun her polearm once, flicking the blood from its tip before resting it casually over her shoulder. "Because next time, I won't miss your heart." Karubi snarled, staggering to his feet, blood still pouring from the gash in his chest. "Do you even understand what you've just done?" he growled through gritted teeth. "If Arlong finds out you dared to attack one of his men, he'll rip you to shreds." "Oh, is that right? Sounds like a challenge." Kuina met his threat with a grin, stepping forward slightly. "But hey, who knows if you'll still be breathing long enough to tell him." Karubi gritted his tack with another furious retort when suddenly, "You think you can challenge me, huh?" A chilling voice echoed through the square, freezing the blood of everyone present. Many villagers, including Genzo and Najiko, went pale as their eyes landed on the one figure they feared most, Arlong. He was striding toward them, his presence alone enough to suffocate the air, made even more terrifying by what he held in his grasp. Dangling limply from his fist by the collar was the lifeless body of Captain Nezumi, his arms and legs dragging across the dirt as Arlong advanced with slow, deliberate steps. However, just then, a thought struck Najiko like a bolt of lightning. "Wait, didn't Luffy say Nami went to take her revenge on Nezumi?" she thought. Her eyes shifted to the lifeless body dangling from Arlong's hand, and suddenly the pieces clicked into place. A flicker of doubt and realization flashed across her face. Her mouth opened, ready to voice the question trembling on her lips, but before she could say a word, Luffy, still standing beside her, gently reached out and took her hand. She turned to him, startled, and found him giving her a playful wink. Then, with a soft smile, he raised a finger to his lips in a silent, "Shish." Meanwhile, Karubi's grin stretched wider, his confidence surging now that Arlong had finally arrived to stand at his side. He straightened his posture, puffing out his chest as if the pain from his wound had vanished completely. "Ha ha ha. All that tough talk earlier. Turns out it was just because you got lucky with one hit, wasn't it?" He jeered, his voice filled with spite, unwilling to admit that he'd been outsped by a human, especially not in front of Arlong. "So, this is the little piece of human trash who dared to lay a hand on you, huh?" Arlong said, his voice cold with contempt as his sharp, predatory eyes locked onto Kuina. A cruel smirk tugged at the corner of his lips as he gave Karubi a firm slap on the back. "In that case, go on, Karubi. Show these worms what happens when they forget their place. Let's see who still has the guts to raise a hand against you while I'm standing right here." "Gladly," Karubi snarled, cracking his knuckles one by one as he stepped forward, his blood-stained chest rising with every breath. Without hesitation, he shifted into his fishman karate stance, feet planted wide, arms poised to strike. Kuina wasn't about to wait for him to make the first move. The moment he shifted forward, she mirrored him in perfect rhythm, sliding one foot behind her to lower her center of gravity. Her grip tightened around the shaft of her polearm, ready to defend and strike back. However, before either Karubi or Kuina could make a move, Arlong suddenly lifted his other hand, revealing a flintlock double-barrel shotgun. A split second later, bang! The deafening gunshot cracked through the air, echoing across the village square like a thunderclap. And then, before anyone could even register what had happened, a gaping hole exploded through Karubi's chest. Gasps rang out as horrified eyes turned to him. Blood sprayed the ground as he staggered, the strength draining from his body with every faltering heartbeat. But no one looked more stunned than Karubi himself. Slowly, shakily, he turned around to face the one he thought was his captain and brother, his expression frozen in disbelief. Why? He croaked, eyes wide with confusion and betrayal as his knees buckled beneath him, as darkness slowly began to overtake his vision. "Why, you ask?" Arlong mocked, laughing coldly as shimmering ripples rippled across his skin. The towering, muscular form of Arlong began to shrink and contort. Muscles slimmed, skin lightened, and within seconds, standing in his place was a slender, toned human girl with bright reddish-orange hair. "Now you get it, don't you?" she said with a vindictive, gleeful smile. one so chilling that even Nijiko flinched. N. Nami? Karubi gasped, eyes widening in disbelief as the truth hit him like a hammer. But the shock on his face didn't last long. It twisted and warped into raw hatred. Blood bubbling from the wound in his chest, he began to stagger forward, dragging his broken, failing body toward her, step by agonizing step. I knew it. I knew keeping a filthy human like you around was a bad idea. Arlong should've gotten rid of you from the start. He snarled, his voice strained and wheezing, yet every word still laced with venom. But, don't worry. I will correct this mistake now. With a hoarse, animalistic roar, Karubi lunged. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked onto Nami with murderous intent as he threw his last dying strength into one final strike, making her freeze in place as she realized in that split second that she had neither the time nor the reflexes to dodge. Fortunately for her, before Karubi could reach her, a green pole-head shot forward and pierced straight through his heart. And just like that, Karubi collapsed in a heap at Nami's feet, his final breath escaping as a choked rattle, leaving behind nothing but blood, venom, and hatred etched into lifeless eyes. Next time, don't steal my prey, Kuina said coolly as she yanked her polearm from Karubi's chest with a slick, wet squelch before giving it a lazy flick, scattering blood across the ground. I'm not always in such a generous mood. Thank you, Nami murmured, still trying to catch her breath. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her as the rush of adrenaline hadn't quite faded yet. Really? Thank you for saving me. Nami, Luffy called out as he strode over, his tone a mix of concern and exasperation. What did I tell you? The power I gave you is for trickery and sneak attacks, so don't put yourself in danger just to gloat at your enemies. Yeah, that was my bad, Nami said with a sheepish smile, rubbing the back of her head. I didn't think he had anything left in him. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people hurt, Luffy replied while shaking his head. You never assume someone's out of the fight unless they're dead, or unconscious at the very least. So from now on, don't lower your guard unless you're absolutely sure you've got the situation under control and you're sure that the threat's truly gone. Just then, Nijiko rushed over and grabbed Nami by the shoulders. Nami, what was that? How did you do that? She asked with disbelief in her eyes. How did you turn into Arlong? Oh, you mean this? Nami said with a mischievous grin, and the next moment, ripples of dark blue scales rippled across her body as she transformed, taking on Nijiko's exact appearance. Ta-da, what do you think? It's like we're twins now. Nijiko blinked, stunned. She slowly reached out and touched Nami's cheek, her fingers brushing against skin that felt no different than her own. Unbelievable. It's like I'm looking into a mirror, she whispered, eyes flicking over every detail with curiosity. Even your voice. It sounds exactly like mine. Standing beside them, Luffy grinned at Nijiko's reaction to the effects of the Kiera no Mi model. Mystique, Raven Darkholme, a custom devil fruit modeled after the Marvel character Mystique. Thanks to this power, Nami could flawlessly mimic anyone's appearance, voice, and even subtle details like fingerprints and scent. Additionally, the fruit also granted her the ability to morph parts of her body at will, sprouting claws, wings, or hardened, armor-like skin when needed. Her healing rate was significantly enhanced. Her body could adapt to resist toxins and diseases, and she had a built-in safeguard against telepathic intrusion, making her mind difficult to read or manipulate. Moreover, according to Raphael, that was still just the surface. Once Nami fully mastered her abilities, she'd be capable of regenerating lost limbs, shifting her internal organs to avoid fatal injuries, mimicking inorganic materials like weapons or tools from her own flesh, and even replicating the haki signature of her targets, though Odi used haki and matched the target's level herself. Well, Nami, are you done showing off? Luffy asked with a smirk. You know we've got another party to crash. Yep, all done. Just let me dress for the occasion, Nami grinned, and once again, blue scales shimmered across her body as her form began to shift, to be continued.